The Carpet People by Terry Pratchett. Read by Tony Robinson. They called themselves the Munrungs. It meant the people, or the true human beings. It's what most people call themselves to begin with. And then one day the tribe meets some other people and gives them a name like the other people, or if it's not been a good day, the enemy. If only they'd think up a name like some more true human beings, it'd save a lot of trouble later on. Not that the Munrungs were in any way primitive. Pismire said they had a rich native cultural inheritance. He meant stories. Pismire knew all the old stories and many new ones, and used to tell them while the whole tribe listened enthralled and the nighttime fires crumbled to ashes. The oldest story was the shortest. The tribe knew it by heart. It was a story told in many languages all over the carpet. "In the beginning," said Pismire, "there was nothing but endless flatness. Then came the carpet which covered the flatness. It was young in those days. There was no dust among the hairs. They were slim and straight, not bent and crusty like they are today. And the carpet was empty. Then came the dust, which fell upon the carpet, drifting among the hairs, taking root in the deep shadows. From the dust the carpet wove us all. First came the little crawling creatures that make their dwellings in burrows and high in the hairs. Then came the sorats and the weft borers, trumps, goats, groam pipers, and the snags. Now the carpet had life and noise, yes, and death and silence. But there was a thread missing from the weave on the loom of life. The carpet was full of life, but it did not know it was alive. It could be, but it could not think. It did not even know what it was. And so, from the dust, came us, the Carpet People. We gave the carpet its name, and named the creatures, and the weaving was complete. Though Fray, who hates life in the carpet, may tread upon us, we are the soul of the carpet, and that is a mighty thing. We are the fruit of the loom. Of course, this is all metaphorical, but I think it's important, don't you? It was the law that every 10th year the people of all the tribes in the Dumai Empire should come and be counted. They didn't go all the way to the great capital city of Ware, but to the little walled town of Tregon Marus. The counting was always a great occasion. Tregon Marus would double in size and importance overnight as tribal tents were pitched outside its walls. And there was the counting itself. New names were added to the crackling scrolls, which, the people liked to believe, were taken to Ware, even to the great palace of the emperor himself. The Dumai clerks laboriously wrote down how many pigs and goats and tromps everybody had, and one by one the people shuffled on to the next table and paid their taxes in furs and skins. Even the youngest babies were carried past the clerks, for the quill pens to wobble and scratch their names on the parchment. Many a tribesman got a funny name because a clerk didn't know how to spell, and there's more of that sort of thing in history than you might expect. After 5 days, the people went back to their homes along the roads the Dumai had built. They went east. Behind them, the road went west until it came to the city of Ware. Beyond Ware, it became the West Road, becoming narrower and more winding until it reached the furthermost western outpost of Rug. Such was the Dumai Empire. It covered almost all of the carpet from the wood wall to the wasteland near Varnishholm in the north. In the west it bordered wildland and the uttermost fringes of the carpet, and southwards the roads ran as far as the heathlands. The painted people of the wainscot, the warlike Hibolgs, even the fire-worshippers of Rug, all paid their tribute to the emperor. Some of them didn't like the Dumai much, usually because the Empire discouraged the small wars and cattle raids, which in the outlying regions were by way of being a recreational activity. The Empire liked peace. So the Munrung tribe went east, and passed out of the chronicles of the Empire for another 10 years. Then one year, no more was heard from Tregon Maris. Old Grim Auxon, chieftain of the Munrungs, had 2 sons. The eldest, Glurk, succeeded his father as chieftain when old Auxon died. To the Munrung way of thinking, which was a slow and deliberate way, there couldn't have been a better choice. He looked just like a second edition of his father, from his broad shoulders to his great thick neck, the battering centre of his strength. Glurk could throw a spear further than anyone. He could wrestle with a snarg, and wore a necklace of their long yellow teeth to prove it. He could lift a horse with one hand, run all day without tiring, and creep up so close to a grazing animal that sometimes they'd die of shock before he had time to raise his spear. Admittedly, he moved his lips when he was thinking, and the thoughts could be seen bumping against one another like dumplings in a stew, but he was not stupid. Not what you'd call stupid. His brain got there in the end, it just went the long way round. "He's a man of few words, and he doesn't know what either of them mean," people said, but not when he was within hearing. One day towards evening, he was trampling homeward through the dusty glades, carrying a bone-tipped hunting spear under one arm. The other arm steadied the long pole that rested on his shoulder. In the middle of the pole, its legs tied together, dangled a snarg. At the other end of the pole was Snibril, Glurk's younger brother. Old Auxon had married early and lived long, so a wide gap filled by a string of daughters that the chieftain had carefully married off to upright and respected and above all well-off Munrungs separated the brothers. Snibril was slight, especially compared with his brother. Grim had sent him off to the strict Dumai school in Tregon Maris to become a clerk. "He can't hardly hold a spear," he said. "Maybe a pen would be better. Get some learning in the family." When Snibril had run away for the 3rd time, Pismire came to see Grim. Pismire was the shaman, a kind of odd-job priest. Most tribes had one, although Pismire was different. For one thing, he washed all the bits that showed at least once every month, and he didn't wear lots of feathers and bones, and he didn't talk like the other shaman in neighbouring tribes. Other shaman ate the yellow-spotted mushrooms that were found deep in the hair thickets, and said things like, which certainly sounded magical. Pismire said things like, "Correct observation followed by meticulous deduction and the precise visualization of goals is vital to the success of any enterprise. Incidentally, don't eat the yellow-spotted mushrooms." Which didn't sound magical at all, but worked a lot better. He was also the official medicine man, and better than the last one they had had, whose idea of medicine was to throw some bones in the air and cry, Pismire just mixed various kinds of rare dust in a bowl, made it into pills, and said things like, "Take one of these when you go to bed at night, and another one if you wake up in the morning." And occasionally he offered advice on other matters. Grim was chopping sticks outside his hut. "It'll never work," said Pismire, appearing behind him in that silent way of his. "You can't send Snibril off to Tregon again. He's a Munrung. No wonder he keeps running away. He'll never be a clerk. It's not in the blood, man. Let him stay. I'll see he learns to read." "If you can learn him, you're welcome," said Grim, shaking his head. "He's a mystery to me. Spends all his time moping around. His mother used to be like that. Of course, she got a bit of sense once she got married." So Snibril went to Pismire's village school with the other children and learnt numbers, letters, and the Dumai laws. He enjoyed it, sucking in knowledge as though his life depended on it. It often did, Pismire said. And strangely, he also grew up to be a hunter almost as good as his brother, but in different ways. Glurk chased, Snibril watched. When old Grim died, he was laid in a barrow dug out of the dust of the carpet, with his hunting spear by his side. Munrungs had no idea where you went when you died, but there was no reason to go hungry once you got there. Glurk became chieftain, and would have to take the tribe to the next counting. But the messenger to summon them to Tregon Maris was long overdue, and that worried Glurk. Usually the Dumai were very reliable, especially over tax gathering, but as he and his brother wandered homeward that evening, he kept his thoughts to himself. Snibril grunted and heaved the pole onto his other shoulder. "Can't we stop for a rest?" he said. 5 minutes won't hurt, and my head aches." 5 minutes, then," said Glurk. "No more, it's getting dark." They had reached the Dumai road, and not far north of it lay the wood wall, home, and supper. They sat down. Both brothers gazed down the road, shining in the dim evening air. The road stretched west, a glowing line in the darkness. It had fascinated Snibril, ever since his father had told him that all roads led to Ware. So it was only the road that lay between the doorway of his hut and the threshold of the Emperor's palace, he thought. He put his head in his hands. The ache was worse. It felt as though he was being squeezed. The carpet had felt wrong too today. The hunting had been hard. Snibril groaned. He'd have to ask Pismire for a pill. A shadow flickered high up in the hares and flashed away towards the south. There was a sound so loud as to be felt by the whole body, hitting the carpet with horrible suddenness. The brothers sprawled in the dust as the hares around them groaned and screamed in the gale. Glurk gripped the rough bark of a hare and hauled himself upright, straining against the storm that whipped round him. All round the hares waved like a grey sea. Holding on tightly with one hand, Glurk reached out with the other and hauled his brother to safety. Then, as quickly as it had come, the storm veered south, and the darkness followed it. Snibril blinked. Whatever it was, it had taken the headache with it. His ears popped. Then he heard the sound of hooves on the road as the wind died away. They got louder very quickly and sounded wild and frightened, as though the horse was running free. When it appeared, it was riderless. Its ears lay back flat on its head, and its eyes flashed green with terror. The white coat glistened with sweat. Reins cracked across the saddle with the fury of the gallop. Snibril leapt in its path. Then, as the creature hurtled by him, he snatched at the reins, raced for a second by the pounding hooves, and flung himself up into the saddle. Why he did that, he never knew. He just couldn't imagine not doing it. They rode into the village, the quiet horse carrying them and dragging the snarg behind it. The village stockade had been broken in several places, and grit boulders had smashed some huts. Glurk climbed down from the horse's back and walked slowly towards his home, or what had been his home. The rest of the tribe stopped talking and drew back, awed, to let him pass. A hare had fallen, a big one. It had crushed the stockade, and the tip of it lay across what was left of the Auxon hut. Bertha Auxon came running forward with her children round her and flung herself into his arms. "Pismire got it out before the hare fell," she cried. "Whatever shall we do?" He patted her absently, but went on staring at the ruined hut. Then he climbed along up the mound of wreckage and prodded about. So silent was the crowd that every sound he made echoed. Then he raised his fist above him and swore. He cursed by the hares, by the dark caverns of underlay, by the demons of the floor, by the weft and by the warp. He bellowed the unutterable words, and swore the oath of Ret Watshud the Frugal. When he had finished, the air trembled. He flopped down on the wreckage and sat with his head in his hands, and no one dared approach. Snibril dismounted and wandered over to where Pismire was standing gloomily wrapped in his goatskin cloak.
He shouldn't have said the unutterable words, said Pismire more or less to himself. It's all superstition, of course, but that's not to say it isn't real. Oh, hello. I see you survived.
What did this?
It used to be called Fray, said Pismire.
I thought that was just an old story.
Doesn't mean it was untrue. I'm sure it was Fray. The changes in air pressure, to begin with, the animals sensed it, just like it said in the...
He stopped.
Just like I read somewhere,
he said awkwardly. He glanced past Snibril and brightened up.
You've got a horse, I see.
I think it's been hurt. Pismire walked to the horse and examined it carefully.
It's to my eye, of course, he said. Someone fetch my herb box. Something's attacked him, see? Here? Not deep, but it should be dressed. A magnificent beast. Magnificent. No, rider?
We rode up the road away, but we didn't see anyone. Pismire stroked the sleek coat.
Something scared him. Not Fray. Something days ago. It wasn't bandits. They don't leave claw marks. A snarg could have made that if it was 3 times its normal size. Oh dear. And there are such, he said.
The cry came. It was a mocking screech that split the darkness. The horse reared. A fire had already been lit at the break in the wall, and some hunters ran towards it, spears ready. They stopped. On the further side there was a mounted shape in the darkness, and 2 pairs of eyes. One was a sullen red, one pair shimmered green. They stared unblinking over the flames at the villagers. Glurk snatched a spear from one of the gaping men and pushed his way forward. "Nothing but a snog," he growled, and threw. The spear struck something, but the green eyes only grew brighter. Pismire ran forward with the blazing stick in his hand and hurled it at the eyes. They blinked and were gone. With them went the spell. Cries went up, and ashamed of their fear, the hunters surged forward.
"Stop!" shouted Pismire. "Idiots! That was a black snarg, not like the brown ones you get around here. You know the stories? They're from the furthest corners, from the unswept regions."
From the north, from the white cliff of the wood wall itself, came again the cry of a snarg. This time it did not die away, but stopped abruptly. Pismire stared north for a second, then turned to Glurk and Snibril.
"You have been found," he said. "That was what brought this horse here. Fear of the snargs. Now they have discovered the village, you can't stay. They'll come every night, until one night you won't fight back hard enough. Leave tomorrow."
"We can't just—" Glurk began.
"You can. You must. Fray is back, and all the things that come after. Do you understand?"
"No," said Glurk.
"Then trust me," said Pismire, "and hope that you never do have to understand."
Glurk looked worried. "But we've never been frightened of snargs. What's special about these?"
"The things that ride on them," said Pismire.
"There was another pair of eyes," said Glurk uncertainly.
"Worse than snargs," said Pismire. "Got much worse weapons than teeth and claws. They've got brains."
"Well, that's the lot. Come on," said Glurk, taking a last look at the ruins of the hut. "Just a minute," said Snibril. His possessions fitted easily into one fur pack, but he rummaged through them in case anything had been left behind. Right at the bottom, Snibril's fingers closed round a lumpy bag. He lifted it out carefully, taking care not to damage its contents, and opened it. 2, 5, 8, 9, all there. Snibril held up the coins, which gleamed with varnish. They had been shaped from the red wood of the chair-leg mines. One side of each coin carried a carving of the Emperor's head. They were Tarnarii, the coins of the Dumai, and they cost many skins at Tregon Maras. Snibril never quite understood it, but it seemed that so great was the Dumai's love for their emperor, they would give and take the little wooden pictures of him in exchange for skins and fur. At least, so Pismire had said. It was less than a day since Fray had come. But what a day. Arguments, mostly. The richer Munrungs hadn't wanted to leave, especially since no one had a clear idea of where they would go, and Pismire had gone off somewhere, on business of his own. Then, in the middle of the morning, they had heard snarg cries in the south. Someone else said he saw eyes peering over the stockade. After that, the argument stopped. The Munrungs were used to travelling, as people suddenly pointed out. They'd been planning this move for months, probably. No one could say they were running away. They were walking away, quite slowly. Before mid-afternoon, the area inside the stockade was filled with carts, cows, and people carrying furniture. Now the bustle was over, and they all waited for Glurk. His cart was the finest, a family heirloom, with a curved roof covered with furs. It needed 4 ponies to pull it. Behind it, a string of pack ponies, laden with the orcs and wealth in furs, waited patiently. Then came the lesser carts, and after them the poorer hand carts, and the families that could only afford 1 pony and 1/3 shares in a cow. At last came the people on foot. It seemed to Snibril that those who carried all their personal goods in one hand looked a bit more cheerful than those who were leaving half theirs behind. Now they needed Pismire. Where was he? "Isn't he here?" said Glurk. "Well, he knows we're going. He'll be along." "I'm going on ahead to find him," said Snibril shortly. "Well, tell him we'll be moving along towards Burnt End, along the old tracks," said Glurk. Snibril was trotting up the road on the white horse ahead of the procession. The horse had been named Roland. No one questioned his right to name it or to own it. The Munrungs on the whole agreed with Dumai laws, but finders keepers was one of the oldest laws of all. A little way on he turned off the road, and soon the dazzling white wooden cliff of the wood wall rose above the hares. Snibril felt the great immensity of it all around him, stretching far beyond the furthermost limits of the empire. And if the Dumai road might lead to distant places, where might this old track lead? Pismire lived in a shack near the old wood quarry. Some thin, half-wild goats skipped out of the way as Roland trotted into the clearing. Pismire was not there, nor was his little pony. But a freshly tanned snarg skin was hanging by the cave, and someone was lying on a heap of ferns by a small fire, with his hat pulled down over his face. Snibril left Roland in the shade of the hares and drew his knife. He crept towards the sleeper and made to raise his hat brim with the knife point. There was a blur of activity. It ended with Snibril flat on his back, his own knife pressed to his throat, the stranger's tanned face inches from his own. The eyes opened. "He's just waking up," Snibril thought through his terror. "Oh, a Munrung," said the stranger, half to himself. "Harmless." He stood up. "Pismire said one of you might show up. Where is he?" "Gone off to Tregon Maras. He should be back soon." "Who are you?" "I like the name Bane." He was clean-shaven, unusual in anyone but young Dumai boys, and his red-gold hair was bound up in a plait down his back. His face was hard and lined, except for his grin. At his belt hung a fierce-looking short sword, and there was a spear beside his pack. "I was following mouls," he said, and saw the blankness in Snibril's face. "Creatures from the unswept regions originally. Nasty pieces of work. They ride around on these things." He indicated the skin. "Weren't you afraid of the eyes?" Bane laughed and picked up his spear. Then Pismire was with them. The old man showed no surprise that Snibril was there. "Tregon Maras has fallen," he said slowly. Bane groaned.
I mean fallen, said Pismire. Destroyed, and snags everywhere in the ruins. Fray has crushed the town. Where have the tribe gone? Burnt End? Good enough. Very defensible situation. Come on.
Bain had a small pony grazing among the hares. They set off, keeping close to the wooden cliff.
But what is Fray? Said Snibril.
I remember you telling stories about old times, but that was long ago. Some kind of monster, not something real.
The mouls worship it, said Bain. I'm something of an expert.
Snibril looked puzzled. The Munrungs didn't have gods. Life was complicated enough as it was.
I have theories, said Pismire. I've read some old books. Never mind about the stories. They're just metaphors.
Interesting lies, translated Bain.
More like ways of telling things without having to do much explaining. Fray is some kind of force. There were people who used to know more, I think. There were old stories about old cities that suddenly vanished. Just legends now.
Beneath the rugged tip of the wood wall that was called Burnt End, the track divided, going west and north. Glurk stopped his cart and looked up at the burnt black crags. He sniffed the air. "I have forebodings," he told his wife. "We'll wait for Snibril." He cupped his hands round his mouth. "Gather the cart round in a circle," he cried. "We'll camp here." If you could put up with the unpleasantness and the ash, Burnt End was a safe place to be. The hares had broken when the wood wall fell onto the carpet, so there was not much cover for attackers. The feel of the place was unsettling. Glurk ordered an armed man to sit on top of every cart in the circle, and set others to lighting fires and readying the camp for the night. Soon cooking fires sprang up within the ring. Glurk climbed on top of his cart and peered back down the track. Fires got seen by things. Were snargs out there? Well, they could deal with snargs. Snargs had just enough brains to know not to attack a village. Night wore on, and the guards nodded. Outside the bright ring, deeper shadows padded among the hares, and it seemed as though, around the ring of light, a darker ring had grown. They attacked to the south of the ring. There was a howl, then a cart rocked. Its guard leapt for his life. It was Girth, Glurk's eldest son. "All arm! Hold the ring!" cried Glurk, and leapt across the fire with a spear in either hand. One he hurled as he ran, and he heard it hit. These were not like the snargs he knew, came a cold thought out of his mind. They were daring to attack, and they carried men on their backs, or things like men at least, with green eyes and long teeth. Glurk saw another cart go over, and then above him loomed a snarg with a shining collar. There was a roar and a crash, and darkness spread along his arm and drifted across his mind like nightfall. The fires made a beacon for the three as they led their mounts down from the hidden path.
"We should head into the Empire," said Pismire. "Things won't be any—"
He stopped. Bain was drawing his sword. He dismounted quietly and inched forward. With his free hand he motioned Pismire to go on talking.
"And, of course, where is so nice at this time of year?" said Pismire hurriedly.
"Have you known Bain long?" said Snibril.
"He's an old friend."
"But who is—" Bain took one step forward, then whirled round and brought his sword whistling down into the shadows at his side. There was a grunt, and a body fell silently across the path. Snibril gasped and drew back. It wore armour of black leather, sewn with bone rings. At first sight the figure was manlike, but when Snibril went closer, he saw the hairy pelt and paws, and the long animal face.
"Mouls," said Bain. "I can smell 'em." "We must make haste," said Pismire. "They never move alone."
"But it's like a human," said Snibrill. "I thought there were only monsters and animals in the unswept regions." The distant fires were blotted out for an instant, and a snarg cried. Before it had died away, Snibrill was in Roland's saddle and away, the others in close pursuit. As they entered the clearing and the broken rings of carts, Snibrill felt the horse bunch itself together for the leap. He clung on tightly as they cleared a cart's roof and landed lightly inside the ring. Glurk lay still beneath one huge paw of a snarg, the biggest Snibrill had ever seen. The great burning eyes moved and saw Snibrill. He wanted to run, but the horse didn't budge. The rider on the snarg's back had also seen him. It grinned unpleasantly. Snibrill slipped from the horse's back and picked up Glurk's spear. It was heavy. Glurk went in for heavy spears. He held it cautiously, keeping the point aimed directly at the snarg. The snarg and its rider turned to follow him as he moved around. He could see Roland. He'd sidled in a half-circle, and now the snarg and its rider were behind the horse. Roland's tail twitched, and he kicked. Both hooves struck together. The rider sailed past Snibrill's shoulder. He was dead already. No one could look like that and still be alive. The snarg growled in astonishment, glared at Snibrill, and leapt. "You should never have to chase prey," Pismire had always said. Snibrill didn't even think. He left the butt end of the spear wedged in the ground and held on tightly. The snarg realized that it had done something stupid when it was in mid-air, but by then it was too late, because it was hurling itself not at some weak creature, but at a spearhead. That was the first battle. When Snibrill awoke, the night was nearly past. He felt warm and aching. He shut his eyes again hurriedly. "You're awake," said Bain. Roland was tethered to a nearby hare. Snibrill sat up and yawned. "What happened? Is everyone all right?" "Oh, yes. You Munrungs are difficult to kill. But plenty were injured. Your brother the worst, I fear. Pismire is with him now." Snibrill murmured something and looked around him. The camp was as peaceful as a camp could be. The attack had been beaten off. Without saying a word, Bain raked a bundle out of the ashes of the fire. Warm smells rose from it. "Haunch of snarg baked in its own juices," he said. "I killed the owner myself, I'm pleased to say." "I'll have a piece with no fat on it," said Pismire, stepping down from the oxen cart. Snibrill saw the weariness in the old man's face. His herb bag lay beside him, almost empty. "Oh, he's as strong as a horse," he said in answer to their unspoken question. "He should stay in bed for at least 2 days. So I told Bertha 6. He looked at Snibrill. "What about you? You might not have escaped half so easily. I know it's useless to say all this," he added, catching Bain's grin, "but I wish that the people who sing about the deeds of heroes would think about the people who have to clear up after them." He held up his herb bag. "And with this," he said, "just different types of dust, a few useful plants. That's not medicine. Oh, we've lost such a lot." "You said that before," said Snibrill. "What have we lost?" "Knowledge. Proper medicine. Books. If you don't look after knowledge, it goes away. Look at this." He threw down what looked like a belt made up of 7 different-coloured squares linked together with thongs. "That was made by whites. Go on, ask me." "Whites?" said Snibrill obediently. "A tribe. In the old days, the tribe, the first carpet people, the ones who crossed the tiles and brought back fire. They quarried wood at the wood wall. They found out how to melt varnish off a chair leg. Don't see them so much nowadays, but they used to be around a lot, pushing these big varnish boilers from tribe to tribe. Anyway, they used to make these belts. Of course, that was long ago. I haven't seen whites for years. And now their belts turn up as collars on these things. We've lost so much.
We wrote too much down and forgot it.
He shook his head.
I'm going to have a nap.
He wandered off to one of the carts. What did he mean? Said Snibberell.
A nap,
said Bain.
it's like a short sleep.
I mean about writing down too much. What does that mean? Bain looked uncomfortable.
That's up to him to tell you, he said. Everyone has things they remember.
Snibberell watched him patting Roland absently on the muzzle. Who was Bain, if it came to that? He looked like a wild man, but there was something about him. Every move he made was deliberate and careful, as if he'd rehearsed it beforehand. Snibberell wasn't sure if Bain was a friend. He hoped so. He'd be a terrible enemy. A little later they broke camp, with Pismire driving the leading cart. Glurk lay inside, white and shaken, but strong enough to curse colourfully every time they went over a bump. Sometimes Fray rumbled far off in the south. Bain and Snibberell, now wearing the belt around his waist, rode on ahead. The carpet was changing colour. That in itself was not strange. Here the green was fading to yellow. Some hares bore fruit, large prickly balls that grew right out of the trunk of the hare. After a while, they reached a place where two tracks crossed. Bain was looking down the west path with an odd expression. He pointed, and there, coming slowly up the path, was a heavy wagon drawn by a line of bent, plodding figures.
Whites,
said Bain.
Don't speak to them unless they speak first.
I saw them last night, in a dream, began Snibberell. Pismire showed no surprise.
You've got one of their belts.
Snibberell slipped the belt from his tunic, and without quite knowing why he did it, slipped it into his pack. The white-drawn wagon rumbled on until it reached the cairn. Both parties looked across at the others. Then a small white left the cart and walked across to Snibberell and Bain. A deep hood covered its face.
"Hello,"
said the white.
"Hello,"
said Bain.
"Hello,"
nodded the white again. It stood there and said nothing else. "Do they understand language?" said Snibberell.
"Probably,"
said Pismire.
"They invented it."
Snibberell felt its steady gaze from the hidden eyes, and he felt the hardness of the belt rubbing into his back and shifted uneasily. The white turned its gaze on Bain.
"Tonight we eat the feast of bronze. You are invited. You will accept. 7 only, when the night-time fires are lit."
"We accept," said Bain gravely. The white turned on his heel and strode back to the wagon.
"Tonight,"
said Pismire.
"The feast of bronze, eh? Amazing. I thought they never invited strangers."
"Who's invited who?" growled someone from inside the cart. There was a stamping about, and Glurk's head poked through the curtains over the front.
"You know what I said about getting up,"
Pismire began. "Whites? I thought they were just a children's story," Glurk said after it had been explained to him. "Still, it's a free meal. What's wrong with that? Still the truth, I never heard of a bad white." "I'd hardly heard of whites at all until now," said Snibberell.
"There's no question of refusing to go,"
said Pismire.
"That's right,"
said Bain.
"But it's so easy to get things wrong. You know how sensitive they are. They've got all kinds of strange beliefs. Tell them, General."
"Well," said Bain, 7's very important to them. 7 elements in the carpet, 7 coloured.
"Tell them about the chaise."
"I was coming to that. 7 chaise. They're like periods of time. Only the whites know how long. Remember the belt? 7 squares, and each represents a che. So the che of salt, you see, is a time when people prosper and trade, and the che of grit is when they build empires and walls. Am I going too fast? General, thought Snibrill. That's what Pismire said. He tried to recall what Bain had been saying. Oh, so tonight's feast means we're in the Chay of Bronze, yeah? It means it's starting, said Pismire. It's a time of war and destruction. Tonight, whites all over the carpet will celebrate the Feast of Bronze. It's something to do with their memories. All right, said Glurk. We'll go. They entered the whites' little camp sheepishly, keeping together. The oldest white in the group was the master. There were 21 in this group, and Pismire, looking at their cart, pointed out the big varnish boiler on top of it. Snibrill wondered how long it would be before anyone noticed he had shoved the belt back in his pack, but he wasn't going to give it up, he told himself. There were 7 fires close together, and 3 whites around each. They looked identical.
There's something else I forgot to tell you,
said Pismire, as the whites busied themselves over their cooking pots.
They have perfect memories. They remember everything. That's why they find it so hard to talk to ordinary people.
I don't understand, said Snibrill.
Don't be surprised if they give you answers before you've asked the question. Their minds work differently. The past and future are all the same to them. They remember things that haven't happened yet.
Snibrill's jaw dropped. Then we could ask them, he began.
No, we mustn't.
I am Norrell, the kiln master,
said the white on Snibrill's left. My name?
Yes.
Yes. There was...
I know.
How?
You're going to tell me after dinner.
Oh. You really know everything that's going to happen, was all Snibrill could think of to say. There was the trace of a smile in the depths of the hood.
Not everything. How can anyone know everything? But a number of things I do know, yes.
Snibrill looked around desperately. But supposing you knew when you were going to die?
Yes,
said Norrell politely. You could just make sure you weren't there.
Weren't there when you died?
said the white.
That would be a good trick.
No, I mean you could avoid...
I know what you mean. But we couldn't. We have to follow the thread. The one thread. We mustn't break it.
Doesn't anything ever come as a surprise? said Snibrill.
I don't know. What is a surprise?
Can you tell me what's going to happen to me? To all of us? It would help a lot to know the future. The dark hood turned towards him.
It wouldn't.
We need help,
said Snibrill in a frantic whisper.
What's Fray?
Where can we go to be safe? Can't you tell us? The white leant closer.
Can you keep a secret?
It said conspiratorially.
Yes,
said Snibrill.
Really? Keep a secret, even though you'd give anything to tell other people? Can you really keep a secret?
Yes.
Well,
said the white, leaning back again.
So can we.
But
enjoy your meal.
Will I?
Yes, you certainly did. And you may keep the belt.
Oh, you know I've got the belt.
I do now.
Bain and Pismire were quiet when the travellers went back to their carts. Did they tell you anything? Asked Snibrill.
No, said Pismire. They never do, but...
It's the way they acted, said Bain. They can't help it.
They don't like what it is. They're not telling us, said Pismire.
A week passed. The carts went on northward. Around them, the carpet changed. On either side of the narrow track, the hares towered up, and now they were deep red. To Snibrill, it seemed as though they were walking through a great fire that had been frozen suddenly. But it was cool and peaceful, and at night, for the first time since they'd left the village, they heard no snargs. And that, of course, made people want to stop.
"At least for a few weeks," said Cadmic Hargolder, the spearmaker. "They've probably forgotten about us anyway, and perhaps we can go home."
"They don't forget," said Bane. "Not them. Besides, we must go on. Head for where?"
"You two can if you like," said Cadmic. "As for me—"
"As for us, we'll keep together, Cadmic, at least while I'm chief of this tribe," said Glurk. "If any of you think different—"
Well, there was something in that well. It was a very deep well. It was full of unspoken threats. But there were still angry mutterings. Then they came across the moul. It was while Snibril and Bane were walking ahead along the track out of sight, but within hearing of the carts. Snibril said little. He kept thinking about General. He'd seen Dumai officers occasionally, not often. Trigon Maris wasn't very important. Bane moved like a soldier. People called generals shouldn't go around looking so shabby. And now, suddenly, they were going to Ware, apparently. Things would be all right in Ware, though. It was the most famous place in the carpet, better than anywhere else, safe. There were legions and legions of soldiers there. Neither saw the moul until they were almost on top of it. It sat astride its snarg in the middle of the track, hand halfway to sword hilt, staring straight at them with a look of terror. Bane gave a grunt and drew his sword, but Snibril's arm shot out and grabbed his shoulder.
"Look at it,"
said Snibril. "Observe," Pismire always said, before acting. The moul hadn't moved. Snibril crept forward. Then, reaching up, he tapped the creature on its snout. Without saying a word, he pointed to the snarg's legs. Thick drifts of dust lay undisturbed around them. The moul sat there, a statue, staring blankly at nothing.
"How could it—"
Snibril began. "Dunno, Pismire might," said Bane rather roughly, because he felt a bit of a fool. "Come on, you take its head and I'll take its legs." They found Pismire already fully occupied. Glurk had been out hunting and had come back with a wild pig, or at least the statue of one.
"There was a whole herd of these,"
Glurk was saying. He tapped the pig with his spear. It went boing.
"Should be oink," he told them, "not boing."
Pismire took Snibril's knife and rapped the moul on the chest. It went bing.
"Should go
said Glurk. "Are they dead?" asked Snibril.
"Not sure,"
said Pismire.
"Look."
Snibril looked into the moul's eyes. Deep in them there was something, just a flicker, a tiny imprisoned spark in the pool of darkness. Snibril shuddered.
"Amazing," said Pismire. "Premature fossilization. And I didn't know there were any termagants in these parts. Tonight's guards had better be picked for their hearing."
"Why?"
said Glurk.
"Because they'd better wear blindfolds."
"Why?"
There was a shout, and Wino Berius came running up with one of his hounds in his arms.
"Heard him bark," he gasped. "Went to find him. Found him like this."
The dog was still in a crouched position, ready to spring. "What's a termagant?" asked Snibril.
"There have been quite a lot of descriptions of their back view," said Pismire. "Unfortunately, no one who's looked at one from the front has been able to tell us much. They get turned to stone." Amazing. Thought they'd all died out.
That night 10 men stood around the ring, their eyes tightly shut. Snibril was among them, and he stood by Roland, who wore blinkers. And they did it the next night too, and the one after that. And then, on the 3rd night, Snibril was on guard by one of the carts, almost asleep, when he heard a shuffling noise behind him. Something big was in the bushes. He was about to spin around when he heard the jingle of metal. "It's here," he thought. "It's right behind me. If I turn around, I'll be turned to stone. But if I don't turn around, will I be turned to supper?" He stood quite still for 100 years or so. After a while, the shuffling grew fainter, and he risked the briefest look. In the dim light, he could see something bulky, at least twice as tall as he was, disappearing among the hares. He found Roland and quickly put his bridle on, and then he led the horse very quietly in the direction of the jingling. The termagant was so old that he couldn't remember a time when he'd been young. He could dimly remember when there had been other termagants, but he was strong then, and had driven them out. Later on, there had been a people who had worshipped him and built a temple for him to live in, thinking that he was some kind of a god. After he had turned many of them to statues, the ones that were left had fled, and left him in his temple. He had no company now. He was probably the last termagant in the carpet. Sometimes he went to find some company. Anything would do. Just some other living things. He wouldn't even eat them. But it never worked. He only had to get near, and they'd get stiff and cold and unfriendly for some reason. Snibril and Roland had reached the ruined temple. Around him, lit by a faint glow, Snibril could see fallen walls littered with statues. In the centre of the temple there was a ruined altar, and that was the source of the glow. On it and around it were piled treasures. By the treasure was another statue. It was a small warrior, hardly half Snibril's height. Magnificent moustaches hung down almost to its waist. In one hand it held a sword and a round shield, in the other a necklace of glittering salt crystals. Its face was turned up in an expression of surprise. Snibril tethered Roland to a pillar and shuddered. He padded over to the mound of treasure and stared in awe. He stood and stared and saw the warrior out of the corner of his eye, hand reaching out. That was why he'd come, and the termagant had found him. There was a jingling noise. Snibril saw a reflection in the statue's polished shield. It showed something scaly and very nearly shapeless. "It's in the doorway," Snibril thought, "right behind me. But if I turn around—" He unhooked the shield, holding it up so that he could see over his shoulder. The termagant jingled. It peered at the altar and sniffed. Even in the shield the eyes frightened Snibril. Roland gave a whinny, but it ended in the mid-air. Then there was another statue in the cold hall. Snibril thought desperately. The termagant began to jingle towards him. Snibril turned, holding the polished shield before his eyes. Under it he could see the termagant's feet scraping towards him. They were bony and clawed. He started to back away, and then the termagant stopped, for it had seen another termagant. There, in the shield, a scaly green face looked back at it. For a moment the creature had found company. Then, because he was shaking with fear, Snibril tilted the shield. The face vanished. After a moment of shocked silence, the termagant let out a howl of anguish that echoed around the hares. A massive foot stamped. Then the creature collapsed on the floor, put its paws over its eyes, and began to sob. It wasn't only terrifying, it was also embarrassing. Nothing should have that many tears in it. Snibril watched the pool of tears spread out over the floor, and touched the statue of a hare-hog by the wall. It twitched its nose. Wider and wider went the pool. Some statues awoke as it touched them. Little creatures swam valiantly to freedom. Snibril scooped up the tears in the shield and splashed them over Roland. He ran to the warrior by the treasure and drenched him. Nothing happened for a moment. An eyelid flickered. The little warrior was suddenly very much alive. He dropped the necklace and glowered at Snibril.
"Cones, bones, where did you spring from?"
Then he saw the termagant in its pool of tears.
"How long have I been here, stranger?"
"I dunno. This is the 3rd year after the 2nd counting in the reign of the Emperor Targon at Ware," said Snibril.
"You're a Dumai?"
said the released statue. "Sort of,"
"I'm not,"
said the little warrior proudly.
"We don't count. But I've heard of Targon. Before I came here, it was the 22nd year of his rule."
"Then you must have been here a year," said Snibril.
"A year. A year away,"
said the dwarf warrior.
"Far too long."
He bowed solemnly.
"You shall be rewarded for this. I, Brocando, son of Brock, lord of Geopard, king of the deft Meanies, promise you that."
"I didn't do it for any reward," said Snibril. "I just wanted the thing to stop turning everything into statues." Brocando flourished his sword.
1 year of my life,"
he shouted.
"I'll make it pay for that."
Snibril looked at the termagant again. It was lying quite still. "I don't think there's much more you can do to it," he said. "It looks miserable enough to me." Brocando hesitated.
"You may be right,"
he said.
"There is no revenge on a witless beast."
With a soft jingling, the termagant raised its head and opened its eyes. Snibril went to lift his shield, and it slipped out of his hands, rolling down the steps. The termagant stopped it clumsily with a claw and turned it awkwardly until it could see itself again. To Snibril's amazement, it began to coo at its reflection and lay back again with the mirror cuddled in its arms. And then the termagant, with a clank, died. They dragged it up the steps and buried it under the altar stone. Snibril remembered the animals back at the camp and collected some of the tear puddle into a small jewel case from the heap. "Actually," Snibril began as they rode away, "I wouldn't mind just a small reward."
"Certainly."
"My tribe needs somewhere to stay for a while, to repair the wagons and so on. Somewhere where we don't have to look over our shoulders all the time."
"Easily granted. My city is yours. My people will welcome you."
"Are they all small like you?" said Snibril without thinking.
"We deft Meanies are correctly built," said Brocando. "It's no business of ours if everyone else is ridiculously overgrown."
They arrived at the camp just in time to stop the search party that was setting out. Brocando immediately became the centre of attention, something which he enjoyed and was obviously used to. Snibril was more or less forgotten. More or less.
"Where have you been?"
asked Pismire, relieved and angry.
"Wandering off like that. Don't you know there are mouls about?"
"I'm sorry," said Snibril. "Things just happened."
"Well, never mind now," said Pismire. "What's happening over there now? Doesn't any one of your muddle-headed people know how to welcome a king?"
"I don't think so," said Snibril. Brocando was in the centre of a crowd of chattering, staring Munrungs, beaming benevolently.
"There I was,"
he was saying,
"1 step away from the treasure when, jingle, there it was, behind me."
Pismire elbowed his way through the crowd, removed his hat, bowed till his beard touched the ground, and stuck there, confronting a surprised Brocando with a tangle of white locks. "Greetings, O king," said the old man. "Honoured are we that so great a son of so noble an ancestry should deem us worthy to, I am Pismire, a humble philosopher. This is—" He snapped his fingers wildly at Glurk. Come on, protocol is very important. Bow down to the king." "What's the king?" said Glurk, looking round blankly.
"Show some respect,"
said Pismire. "What for? Snibril rescued him, didn't he?" Snibril saw Bane standing at the back of the crowd with folded arms and a grim expression. He hadn't liked school intrigue on Maris, but he'd learned some things. The Dumai didn't like kings. They preferred emperors because they were easier to get rid of. And on the way back from the temple, he'd asked Bracando what he'd meant when he said his people didn't count. It meant they had nothing to do with the Dumai.
Hate them, Bracando had said bluntly. They'd turn everything into things to count. They'd make the hairs of the carpet grow in rows if they could, and worst of all, they obey orders. They'd rather obey orders than think. That's how their empire works.
And now he was about to be introduced to one of them. At which point Bracando amazed him. He walked up to Glurk and shook him warmly by the hand.
"So, you're the chieftain, are you?" he said. "Amazing. Your brother here told me all about you. It must be an incredibly difficult job. Highly skilled, too, I shouldn't wonder."
"Oh, you pick it up as you go along," Glurk muttered, taken aback.
"I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do. Fascinating. Did you have some sort of special training?"
No. Dad died, and they just gives me the spear and said you're the chief," said Glurk.
"Really? We shall have to have a serious chinwag about this later on," said Bracando. "Jolly good. And this must be General Banius Catrix, I believe."
General, Snibril thought. Bane nodded. "You know each other?" said Snibril.
"Oh, yes," said Bracando. "The Dumai kept sending armies to see us and suggest most politely that we submit and be part of their empire. We always told them we didn't want to join. We weren't going to be counted."
"I think it was the paying of taxes you objected to, Your Majesty," said Bane calmly.
"We didn't see what we would get for our money," said Bracando.
"You would be defended," said Bane.
"Ah, but we've always been quite good at defending ourselves," said Bracando in a meaningful tone of voice. "And then the general here was sent to suggest it to us again with a little more force," he said. "I remember he said that he was afraid that if we did not join the Empire, there would be hardly any of us to be counted."
"And you said there'd be hardly anyone left to do the counting," said Bane. Snibril looked from one to the other. "And then what happened?" he said. Bane shrugged. "I didn't attack," he said. "I didn't see why good people should die. I went back and told the Emperor that Bracando's people would make better allies than unwilling subjects. Anyway, only a fool would attack that city."
"I always wondered what he replied," said Bracando.
Bane looked down at his ragged clothes. "He shouted quite a lot," he said. There was a thoughtful pause.
"They did attack, after you been recalled," said Bracando.
"Did they win?"
"Nah."
"You see? Fools," said Bane. Snibril took each of them by the shoulder. "Anyway," he said, "just because you're sworn enemies doesn't mean you can't be friends, does it?" When they were having the evening meal, Glurk said to his wife, "He's very gracious. Asked all about me. I've met a king. He's very important. He's called Protocol, I think."
"Good name. Sounds royal," she said.
"And Pismire's a philosopher," he says.
"I never knew that. What's a philosopher?"
"Someone who thinks," he says,
said Glurk.
"Well, you think. I've often seen you sitting and thinking."
"I don't always think," said Glurk conscientiously. "Sometimes I just sits."
He sighed.
"Anyway, it's not just thinking. You've got to be able to talk about it entertainingly afterwards."
The people turned west. It was a cheerful journey to Geopard, with Bracando riding by the leading cart. They were going somewhere that only a fool would attack. Many of the Munrungs were frankly in awe of the small king, but Glurk was fast becoming an uncritical royalist. Bracando sensed his respectful audience, and chatted to him in that special way royalty has for commoners, which leaves the commoner feeling really cheered up without actually remembering very much about what was said to him. Gradually, the carpet changed colour again, from red to deep purple and then dark blue. The track began to turn into a road, a neatly laid track of thick planks on a bank of dust. On either side the hares grew thinner, and Snibble noticed many stumps. That was not all. No Munrung ever planted a seed. They liked vegetables when they could get them, but except for Pismire's private herb garden, everything that grew around them grew wild. But in the blue land of Jabonia, around the little city of Geopard, the Deftmenes had turned the carpet into a garden. There were hares there that even Pismire hadn't seen before. Delicate stems, their branches laden with fruit. The travellers were shown ripe purple groads that tasted of pepper and ginger, and big master mushrooms that could be dried and stored for years and still kept their delicate flavour.
"Where are the people?" asked Glurk. "All this didn't grow by being whistled at."
There were no people. The fruit hung heavy in the bushes along the roadside, but there were none to pick it. Snibble took up his spear. This was like hunting. You learned about the different kinds of silence. There was one very sharp, hot kind of silence, made by someone there watching. Bane had drawn his sword. They looked at one another. "Shall we leave the carts here?" said Snibble. "See if it'll stick together." The carts moved on slowly. "The bush is just up on the right there," Bane said without moving his head. "I think so too," said Snibble. "They're in there watching us." "Just one, I think," said Snibble.
"I could put a spear into it from here, no trouble," said Glurk.
"No, we might want to ask it questions afterwards," said Bane. "We'll circle around it on either side." Snibble crept towards the bush around one side of a hare. Bane was on the other side of it, and Glurk, who could walk very quietly for such a big man, appeared as if by some kind of magic in front of it, with his spear raised.
"Ready?"
"Ready." "Yeah." Bane took hold of a dust frond and tugged. A small child looked up at 3 trembling blades. It said. And 10 minutes later, a small group of Deftmenes were labouring in the vegetable lines between the hares. They didn't look happy, or for that matter very well fed. Several guards were watching them. Even from here, Snibble could see the long snouts. Among the hares was Geopard itself. It was built on a piece of grit. The actual city was a cluster of buildings at the very top. Glurk crawled up beside Snibble.
"There's mouls and snags everywhere," he said. "The whole place is crawling with them."
"They've got the city?" said Snibble. Glurk nodded. "Come on," said Snibble. "Let's get back to the camp." Pismire, Bane and Bracando were sitting in a semicircle watching the little boy drinking soup.
"My own brother," growled Bracando as the others slipped into the camp. "Turn my back for a few days."
"A year," said Bane.
"And he calls himself king. I never did like Anti-Rock, always skulking and muttering and not keen on sports."
"But how did mouls get into the city?" said Snibble.
"He let them in. Tell the man, Strephon."
The boy was about 7 years old and looked terrified.
They were... Everyone fought," he stuttered.
Come on, out with it, lad."
"I think," said Bane, "that perhaps you ought to wander off for a minute or two. Perhaps. He might find it easier to talk."
"I am his king."
"That's what I mean." Bracando grumbled, but wandered off with Glurk and Snibble.
"Brothers," he muttered. "Nothing but trouble, eh? Plotting and skulking and hanging around, usurping."
Glurk felt he had to show solidarity with the unofficial association of older brothers.
"Snibble never kept his room tidy, I know that," he said.
When they got back, Strephon was wearing Bane's helmet and looking a lot more cheerful.
"If you want it in grown-up language," Bane said, "your brother took over the throne when you didn't come back. He wasn't very popular, there was quite a lot of fighting. So when a pack of mouls arrived one day, he invited them in."
"He wouldn't,"
said Bricando. "He thought he could hire them as mercenaries to fight for him. Well, they fought all right. They say he's still king, although no one has seen him. The mouls do all the ruling. A lot of people ran away. The rest are slaves, more or less. Quarrying grit, forced labour in the fields."
"The mouls don't look as if they'd be interested in vegetables," said Snibril.
"They eat meat."
Pismire's words sunk in like rocks. He gave the word a particular edge that suggested not ordinary meat. Bricando went white.
"Do you mean—"
"They eat animals," said Pismire miserably. "Unfortunately, they consider everything that's not a moul is an animal. Do you know what the word moul means in moul language? It means true human beings."
This sunk in too.
"We'll attack tonight," said Bricando. "No one's eating my subjects."
Said Glurk.
Yes," said Bane. "Yes, indeed, fine. 5,000 soldiers couldn't attack Geopard."
"That's true,"
said Bricando. "So we—"
said Glurk.
"Yes,"
said Bricando. The chieftain appeared to have something on his mind. "I've heard one or two references just recently to we," he said. "I just want to get this sorted out. No offence. As a reward for rescuing you, we're now going to attack this city that no amount of do-my-eye soldiers could capture and fight a lot of mouls. Have I got it right, yes?"
"Good man," said Bricando. "I knew we could depend on you. I shall need 6 stout-hearted men."
"I think I can let you have one astonished one," said Glurk.
"We've got to help," said Snibril. "Sooner or later we've got to fight these things. It might as well be here."
"Well done,"
said Bricando.
Glurk nudged Snibril. "Have we just volunteered for practically certain death?"
"I think we may have, yes."
"This kinging is amazing," said Glurk. "If we get out of this, I think I'm going to try to learn it."
The whites built the city of Geopard. They brought redwood and sparkling varnish from a chair leg to pave its streets. From the hearthlands they led great caravans of the rare jet to be made into domes and cornices, and cinder and ash for bricks and mortar. Everywhere there were gardens. In the evening light it looked peaceful, but they had to lie low twice when moul cavalry went past on the road.
"There's another way into the city,"
said Bricando. "I didn't know that," said Bane.
"Didn't you?"
said Bricando.
"Amazing. All that trouble to build a secret passage, and we forgot to tell the Emperor. Turn right into that little hidden track there."
"What track?" Bricando grinned.
"Good, isn't it?"
he said. It looked like an animal path. It wound round and about the hares. The dust bushes were much thicker here.
"Planted,"
said Bricando. Eventually, when it was almost dark, they reached a small glade with another ruined temple in it.
"This one was built to look ruined," said Bricando, "by the whites, for one of my ancestors."
He hesitated.
"And you're a do-my-eye, and I've brought you to the secret place," he said. "I should have you blindfolded."
"No," said Bane. "You want me to fight for you? Then I'm wearing no blindfold."
"But one day you might come back with an army."
"This is stupid," said Snibril. "You've got to trust one another sooner or later. You're men of honour, aren't you?"
"It's not as simple as that,"
said Bricando. "Then make it simple." He realised he had shouted. Even Glurk was surprised. Bricando nodded.
"Pull Brock's arm."
"What?" said Bane.
"Behind you, on the statue. Pull the arm,"
said Bricando. Bane shrugged and reached for the arm.
There was a grinding noise somewhere under their feet. A slab in the temple floor slid aside, showing a flight of steps.
"It'll lead to the palace,"
said Bricando, grinning. They stared into the square of darkness. Finally, Glurk said, "You don't mean into the underlay?"
"Yes."
But there's terrible things down there."
"Just stories for children,"
said Bricando. He trotted down the steps. Bain went to follow him, and then looked back at the Munrungs. "What's the matter?" he said. Snibbril looked around at the other tribesmen. He thought, at times like this, we all have to forget old things.
"Nothing's the matter," he said. "Come on, lads. Last one in's a—"
"Never mind about the last one," muttered a voice. "We want to see what happens to the first one."
Snibbril tripped at the bottom of the stairs and landed on a pile of soft dust. Bricando was lighting a torch. One by one, the band shuffled down. The walls showed up brown in the torchlight and were covered with tiny hairs that glittered as the light passed them. But there were no monsters, no sudden teeth. The path began to slope down, and suddenly the light from Bricando's torch dimmed. Snibbril started before he realized that they were entering a cavern under the carpet, with walls so far away that the light was not reflected from them. They passed through many great caverns, the path narrowing and spiralling up around great columns of hair, so that they had to cling to stay on it. Eventually, Bricando called a halt. There was a narrow bridge stretching across an abyss, and Snibbril could just make out a door on the far side. The king held up the torch and said,
"We're right underneath the rock now. You are the only people apart from the kings of Geopard to see this. After the secret passage was dug, Brock had all the workers personally put to death to stop the secret escaping."
"Oh, that's part of Kingin too, is it?" said Glurk.
"It used to be," said Bricando. "Not any more, of course."
When they had crossed the bridge, Bricando pushed the little wooden door open, revealing a spiral staircase lit by green light filtering down from a tiny circle of light. It was a long climb up the winding staircase. Ghostly as it was, Snibbril welcomed it. He hated the darkness under the carpet. The stairway opened onto a little landing, just big enough to hold them all. There was another door in the wall.
"Well,"
Glurk began. Bricando shook his head and put his finger to his lips. There were voices on the other side of the door. Snibbril tried to imagine faces. One voice was thin and whiny, already raised in complaint.
"Another 100, but you took 50 only a few days ago."
"And now we need another 100,
said a soft voice that made Snibbril's hair prickle.
"I advise you to sign this paper, Your Majesty, and my guards will gather together this 100 and be gone. They will not be slaves, just assistants."
"I don't know why you don't just take them,"
said the first voice sulkily.
"But you are the king," said the second voice. "It must be right if the king says so. Everything signed and proper."
Snibbril thought he could hear Bain grinning in the darkness.
"But no one ever comes back,"
said first voice. The third voice was like a rumble.
"They like it so much in our lands, we just cannot persuade them to return," it said.
"I don't believe you,"
said first voice.
"Sign."
"No, I will not. I am king."
"And you think that I, who made you king, can't unmake you?" said the second voice. "Sign. Or perhaps Gorash here can find some other use for your hands."
Bricando turned to face the others.
"That's my brother," he said. "Such as he is. Here's the plan. We rush in and we kill as many mouls as possible.
You think that's a clever plan? said Bain.
Sounds sensible to me,
said Glurk. But there's hundreds in the city, aren't there? said Bain.
My people will rise up and overthrow them,
hissed Bracando. Have they got any weapons, then? said Bain.
No, but the mouls have, so they'll start by getting their weapons off them,
said Bracando placidly. Bain groaned. We're all going to die, he said. This isn't tactics, this is just making it up as you go along.
Let's start now, then,
said Bracando. He put his foot against the door and pushed. It moved a fraction, and then stopped. They all put their shoulders to it. It resisted for a moment, and then flew open. There was a shriek. For a second the hall was motionless. Snibril saw a throne lying on the floor. It had blocked the door. A thin, deft meanie was struggling underneath it, making pathetic little noises. Beyond it, 2 mouls were standing, staring at the open doorway. One was big, wide-shouldered, with a pale face almost hidden in his leather helmet. He held a coiled whip in one great paw. Voice 3, Snibril thought. He even looks as though he should be called Gorash. Beside him stood a thin moul, wearing a long black cloak and a grin like a wolf that's just had dinner. Voice 2, said Snibril to himself. Bracando whirred forward like an enraged chicken waving his sword. The thin moul leapt backwards and drew its own sword with disheartening swiftness. Gorash uncircled his whip, but found that Bain was suddenly between him and the king. The Munrungs watched. There seemed to be 2 ways of sword-fighting. Bracando went at it like a windmill, pushing the enemy back by sheer effort. Bain fought quietly, like some kind of machine. Stamp, thrust, parry. Tick-tock, tick. "Shouldn't we help?" said Snibril.
"No, 10 to 2 isn't fair," said Glurk.
The doors at the end of the throne room burst open, and a dozen moul guards ran towards them. "Oh, this is better then, is it?" said Snibril. Glurk threw his spear. One of the guards screamed.
"Yes,"
he said. Snibril found that spears fought well against swords if you didn't throw them. They could prod, and they could parry. And as more guards poured into the room, he realized that it also helped if you were outnumbered. It made it easier to hit an enemy, for one thing. And then it was over. The few remaining guards fell over one another to get out of the door. Gorash was dead. The skinny moul dived through the open doorway to the secret passage. They heard it running down the steps.
"Well, that wasn't too hard,"
said Glurk. "There's hundreds more out there," said Bain gloomily. Bracando went to the balcony. Early morning light was flooding across the hares. He cupped his hands around his mouth.
"I'm back! Bracando!"
He picked up a dead moul, dragged it to the balcony, and pushed it over. There were already some deft meanies in the square below the palace. A shout went up. The king rubbed his hands together.
"Help me with the throne," he said.
It took 3 of them to lift it up. Underneath it was Antirock, who hung limply from Glurk's grip as he was hauled to his feet.
"Give me the crown,"
said Bracando in deadly tones.
"It's the thing on your head, the thing that doesn't belong to you." "We thought you were dead." "You look overjoyed to see me back,"
said Bracando. His expression was terrible.
"Someone had to be king. I had to do my best for the people."
There was a commotion outside. 6 deaf meanies bore down with grim determination on Antirock, who was snatched from Glurk's grasp and hustled towards the balcony. "You can't let them do that," said Snibril. 4 deft meanies had hold of Antirock's arms and legs and were swinging him backwards and forwards high over the roofs of Geopard.
"A 1, a 2, a 3,
they chanted.
"Why not?"
said Bracando.
"He's your brother." "Oh, all right. Put him down, people," said Bracando. "I can't have you subjects throwing my family over the balcony. That would never do."
"Good," said Snibril.
"I'll do it myself." "No!"
It was a chorus.
"Just joking,"
said Bracando. who didn't look it.
"All right, then. He can go."
Anti-Rock fell onto his hands and knees.
"You can't do that. They'll kill me."
"All those people whose relatives you sold to the mouls?" said Bricando.
"Dear me. Of course, you can follow your friend."
He waved towards the passage doorway. Anti-Rock looked horrified.
"But Gormalish went down there," he wailed. "Was that his name?" said Bricando. "You can talk about old times."
Anti-Rock looked imploringly at Bricando, hesitated for a moment, and then dashed for the doorway. It slammed behind him. Snibrill sat outside the palace stables, watching Roland investigate the contents of a nosebag. Snibrill could hear the celebrations going on in the main hall. When Snibrill had wandered out, Glurk had been delighting everybody by lifting 20 deft-meany children on a bench and carrying them around the hall. Snibrill patted Roland absently. "Well, here we are," said Snibrill, "and can't even remember which direction our old village lies in. Bricando says we can stay here as long as we like. Forever, even. Safe and sound. But Bane says he's going on to Ware tomorrow, just in case. And my ears hurt." Roland shifted uneasily. Snibrill raised his head and heard the night breeze die away. The hares were silent. He felt a pricking sensation in his feet. The headache felt like a fire now. Snibrill remembered this feeling, but he thought, not here, surely, where it was all so safe. Yes, he told himself, even here. Fray can be anywhere. He turned and ran up the steps into the palace. "Fray!" he shouted. In the din, no one heard. "Fray is coming!" he shouted louder.
"Coming here?"
said Pismire. "Can't you feel it? Can't you feel it?" Snibrill was desperate with impatience and pain.
"Get to the carts!"
snapped Pismire.
"I can't feel anything," said Bricando. "Anyway, Geopard is safe from any enemy."
Pismire pointed upwards. There were big candle chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. They had begun to swing very gently.
"Run for it! Get everyone outside!" Bricando shouted.
The Munrungs were already streaming through the door. There was a far-off thump. The whole rock shook. The heavy lintel over the door shivered and sagged. Glurk strode forward among the bewildered throng and put his shoulders under it, and stood with one hand braced against each doorpost, while people scrambled under his arms and between his legs. Snibrill was already leading the screaming ponies out of their stable. No sooner was each cart moving than it was loaded down with people. He lifted 4 deft meanies onto Roland's back and sent the horse after the carts, then struggled through the flow to the hall. Glurk had been forced almost to his knees, his face purple. Snibrill grabbed an arm. "Come on, the whole building is going to go."
"No,"
came the low growl.
"Pismire and the others are still in there."
Another tremor shook the hall. A pillar cracked, and Glurk grunted.
"Get out of the way,"
came a whisper from deep in his throat.
"It's gonna go."
The rock shook underfoot. I'll get some people with beams and things," said Snibrill. "We'll soon have you out. Don't go away." Glurk grunted as Snibrill hurried away. Pismire appeared through the smoke.
"What are you doing still here?" he said.
"Going to be in a story,"
said Glurk. Bane groped his way out of the billows. "Come on," he said. "Bricando's got the secret door open."
"Help me with this idiot," said
Pismire.
"Looks wedged to me,"
said Bane.
"Gonna be a hero,"
said Glurk.
"Bone-headed, I call it," said
Pismire.
"I saved a lot,"
Glurk began. Then he toppled over.
"Grab him," said Pismire. "That wall's falling in."
They took an arm each and stumbled out of the way as the lintel thudded into the floor, splitting it.
"Quickly!"
Bricando was standing by the door to the stairway.
"Come on!"
The whole roof fell in. They ran down the steps, the others carrying Glurk between them like a battering ram.
"Not out of the hairs yet?"
panted Bricando.
"What mean?" puffed Pismire.
"No torches."
They piled into the little door at the bottom of the steps and lay panting in the blackness.
"Do you think you can find the way to the statue in the dark?" said Bain.
"That was the first time I've ever been down here,"
wailed Bricando.
"But there must be other entrances,"
said Pismire. He thought of the deep crevasses and windy caves of Underlay and the stories of the creatures that dwelt there. Of course he didn't believe in them. He shivered. He hoped they didn't believe in him.
"If we keep together and test every step, we should be safe,"
came Bricando's unsteady voice.
"There's 4 of us. What would dare attack us?"
"Lots of things."
"Apart from them."
Glurk got heavier and heavier as the hours passed. They carried him head first and feet first, sometimes propping him up against a hair root while they inched hand in hand along strange paths. Eventually they sat down for a rest.
"What's below Underlay?"
said Bricando.
"The floor,"
said Pismire's voice out of darkness.
"What's below that?"
"Nothing. That's as far as there is. You might as well ask what's above the carpet." It was strange talking to people when everything was completely black.
"Pismire,"
said Bricando.
"What now?" "What about mouls? Do they come down here?" "It's your tunnel. You should know. I can't imagine why they'd want to, though."
"Correct."
There was silence.
"Was that you?"
"I thought it was you." "Bricando?"
"Pismire."
"Bain?" "What?"
"You see,"
said Gormalish's voice by Pismire's ear,
"we can see in the dark."
Claws gripped them as easily as a child grips a toy.
"Well, well," said
Gormalish from somewhere nearby.
"What an unexpected treat."
"Is my brother with you?"
said Bricando. After a pause, Gormalish said,
"In a manner of speaking, now you will do what I say. The little king will hold on to Purgish's tail, the old man hold on to the king's belt, the Dumai soldier hold on to the old man's belt. Anyone try to run away, that person is a dead person."
Bricando, who could count quite quickly for a king, said,
"But what about... Ow!
"Sorry," said Pismire, who could count faster. "Did I accidentally kick you? Well, he's right. He's got all 3 of us."
"But we can't leave the... Ow! Oh, yes, of course. Yes, I see. You're right."
Bricando's voice suddenly took on the kind of excited conspiratorial tone that would have made anyone smell a rat who didn't already smell like a moul.
"All 3 of us. Yes, you've definitely got all 3 of us. How well can you see in the dark, incidentally? Probably not 100%, eh?"
"Oh, no," Pismire thought. "How can they not get suspicious after that?"
"Ow!"
said Gormalish. "Moul scum," said Bain. "When I get out, I'll—" There was the sound of a slap in the darkness.
"When you get out," said Gormalish, "you will do exactly as I say. Bring them along."
Well done, thought Pismire. Bain can count fast as well. They were marched along in a shuffling single file for quite a short time. They must have been close to a way up to the surface. Pismire felt his hands guided to a ladder.
"We're going up and out," he thought. "If Glurk wakes up, how will he know?"
He climbed a few steps and then let himself drop again.
"Ow! My leg! Ow!
The noise echoed around the caves of Underlay.
"What is the matter with your leg, old man?" said Gormalish. Nothing," said Pismire, and climbed back up the ladder. "And if Glurk hasn't heard that, we're done for."
It was already night on the surface. They'd climbed out into a clearing a long way from Geopard. It seemed to be a gathering place for the surviving mouls from the city. The prisoners were tied up with leather thongs and thrown down by a bush. Nearby, a pack of snargs eyed them hungrily. The mouls were talking in their own language. "They're taking us somewhere called Gagatas, if that means anything," said Bain.
"That's their word for the High Gate land, I think," said Pismire, "where the Vortgorns live." "Them? They're our mortal enemies," said Bracando. "We like to have several mortal enemies at one time, just in case we run out."
Pismire was lying a little apart from the other two. In the glow of the moul's campfire he could just make out a guard lounging by the little overgrown entrance to Underlay, with his snarg tethered to a dust bush. An arm was slowly growing out of the dust bush behind the unsuspecting moul. It stopped a few inches above his head and carefully removed his helmet. The moul turned and met a fist coming the other way. The arm caught him before he fell and dragged him into the bush. A moment later, the hand appeared by the snarg and started untethering it. It looked up, and with horror Pismire saw its eyes narrow. Before it could growl, though, the hand bunched up into a knotted fist and smacked it smartly between the eyes. He saw it fall over slowly. Before it reached the ground, the tether tightened and tugged it into the bush. Pismire didn't know why, but suddenly he felt sure that everything was going to be all right. All that night they journeyed south. The next days merged for the prisoners into one continuous blur of running feet and moul voices. And then there was a place above the carpet, the High Gate land of the Vortgorns. First it was a glimmer between the hairs. An hour later it loomed above them, the largest thing Pismire had ever seen, and it shone. It was bronze. All the metal in the carpet came from there. Snibbril knew that much. The Vortgorns had to trade it with the whites for food.
"One penny,"
said Pismire under his breath, while the party stopped for a brief rest under the very walls of the land.
"What?"
said Bracando.
"That's the battle cry of the Vortgorns," said Pismire. "One penny. It's written on the land, huge metal letters. I've seen pictures." "Who wrote them?"
said Bracando, eyeing the guards.
"The Vortgorns think it was done by Fray," said Pismire. "They used to say there's letters under the land, too. They dug tunnels and found them. Some of them say—"
He concentrated.
"Elizabeth 1-1. The Vortgorns seem to think that's very important. Giant letters can't just grow by themselves," said Bracando. "They might. Who knows?"
The mouls milled around aimlessly, waiting for something.
"I suppose we're waiting to get up there,"
said Bracando.
"But how?"
Pismire, who was squinting upwards, said,
I think this remarkable mechanism is the secret."
High above them was a speck on the wall. Slowly it grew bigger, became a wide platform sliding down the bronze. They could see heads peering over the side of it. When it landed beside the pack, Pismire saw that it was a simple square made of hair planks with a railing round them. 4 bronze chains, one from each corner, rose up into the mists. A man stood at each corner. Each one was as tall as Bain. They wore helmets and body armour of beaten bronze, and carried by their sides long bronze swords. Their hair was the colour of the metal. They had short square beards, and grey eyes that stared calmly ahead of them. Too much metal, Pismire thought. It enters the soul. Bracando whispered as they were pushed forward onto the platform.
You haven't seen or heard anyone, as it were, following us, the big fellow?
Not a sign since we left Underlay, said Pismire.
Oh, dear.
Oh, no, that's good news. It means he's out there somewhere. Gluck's a hunter, you see.
Good point.
The chains around them shook and rattled as they took up the slack, and with a creaking, the platform swung off the ground and up towards the land. Pismire noticed a shadow detach itself from the dust bush by the base of the wall and dash for the rising platform, trying to find a handhold on the underside. He saw it leap, but at that moment the platform swung, and he couldn't see the shadow again. Up rose the entrance to the land, through swirling fogs, and then he realized he was looking over the carpet.
The deft meanies say this land fell out of the above many years ago, he said. The Vortgorns were just another small tribe that lived nearby. They climbed it too, and hardly ever come down.
The platform ground on up the wall, until suddenly it stopped. Before them was a bronze gate built on top of the wall. Just above it, heavy gantries carried the pulleys that raised and lowered the platform. The gateway was spiked, and the portcullis in it was tipped with spikes. Beneath them, far beneath, lay the carpet. Gormalish hissed,
Look your last at your precious carpet. You will not see it again.
Melodrama,
said Pismire. The mouls marched onto the Highgate land. Pismire saw a broad metal plateau. On either side as they marched were cages with thick bars. They contained snags. They hurled themselves at their bars as the prisoners passed. On they went, and there were compounds where snags were being broken in and trained. Further, and there were more cages, bigger than those of the snags. They contained strange creatures. They were huge. They had fat barrel bodies with ridiculous small wings, and long thin necks tipped with heads that wobbled slowly round as they passed. At the other end they had a stubby little tail. One of the creatures poked its head through the bars and looked down at Pismire. Its eyes were large, but bright and oddly intelligent.
A pone, he said. A pone. The biggest things in the carpet. Oh, if we had a few of those at our command.
I think perhaps they are under the command of the mouls, said Bain. The pone watched him pass. They reached the angular metal hills and went through a dark archway. Inside they were handed over to other, swarthier mouls. They passed through a maze of tunnels until they came to a dimly lit hall lined with doors. One was opened, and they were thrown inside. Gormalish's grinning face appeared at the bars, lit red in the torchlight of the dungeons.
Enjoy the hospitality of our dungeons while you may. Soon you'll go to the mines. There you will not sleep, but you'll be safe from Fray. Why do they talk like that? Said Pismire. Melodrama. I'm amazed he doesn't go, ha-ha, ha-ha!
They lay in the darkness, listening to a distant knocking of hammers.
So, these are the mines,
said Bracando,
where my people have been taken. Mining metal.
Everyone's people by the sound of it,
said Pismire. They were roughly woken by the prodding of a spear. Two mouls were standing in the doorway, grinning down at them.
These three for the mines, eh?
Oi! Came a growl from outside. Pismire's ears pricked. Let's see, came the voice from outside. The prisoners were thrust out into the dim hall. A bronze-clad Vortgorn stood there, terrible in the half-light. You stupid oafs,
he snarled at the mouls. "Look at their bonds, practically falling off." And he strode forward and caught up Pismire's hands. The old man looked for a moment into familiar brown eyes, one of which winked at him.
"We tightened them special,"
said one moul indignantly.
"Oh, yes, look at this one, then."
The other said,
"They're as tight as a—"
The Vortigern reached out and placed one gnarled hand about each hairy neck. The voice faded to a strangled squeak. The Vortigern brought his hands together with a satisfying crack and let the stunned creatures drop. Glurk removed his helmet.
"Well, here we are, then,"
he said. He couldn't resist dancing a little jig in front of their staring faces.
"We left you in Underlay."
"How'd you come here?"
"It was you I saw,"
cried Pismire. Glurk took a knife from his belt and cut their ropes. He handed them the guards' swords.
"Try to look like prisoners if anyone sees you," he said. "There's all sorts up here."
Glurk led in his Vortigern armour.
"Where are we going?"
said Pismire.
"I found some friends. You know why the mouls attacked Geopard?"
"To subjugate and enslave a proud people,"
said Bricando.
"For grit."
"Grit?"
"That's what Geopard's built on, isn't it? Stone chisels, see? They use dozens of them just to hack out a bit of metal."
"My lovely city."
"Grit," said Glurk. "Metal," said Bane. "They're trying to get as much metal as they can."
"Why all this effort, I wonder?"
said Pismire. "Ware's only a few days away," said Bane. "That's why."
"Come on, in here,"
said Glurk. Here was a long cave mined out of the bronze. The air was warm and smelt of animal.
"These are pones, aren't they?"
said Bricando.
"Not easy to mistake for anything else. Why are they here?"
said Pismire.
"They turns the wheels for the lifting platform," said Glurk. "They're used for all the heavy work. Know something? They're intelligent."
"No, that's just a story,"
said Pismire airily.
"They look bright, I'll grant you, but they've got a brain the size of a dried pea."
"But a very clever dried pea," said Glurk. "I lay low in here last night. They've got a language, all made up of thumps and nose honks. Watch."
A tiny head was lowered towards him out of the shadows, and two bright eyes blinked.
"If you can understand me, stamp twice," he said hoarsely.
Thud. Thud. Even Glurk himself looked surprised.
"These are friends. Your help okay?"
Thud, thud.
"That means yes," said Glurk.
"Really?" said Pismire.
"There's his saddle, by the stall."
It was more like a small castle. Inside were cushioned seats, and on the decorated harness was the card Acretongue in tarnished bronze letters. Pismire sidled closer to the pone while the others were manhandling the saddle, and held up his hand with the fingers spread out.
"How many fingers am I holding up?"
he said suspiciously. Thud, 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 thud.
"Aha! So much for
Thud.
Lucky guess."
The pone lumbered down onto his knees to let them heave the saddle onto his back. Then he opened his mouth and trumpeted. It sounded like the creaking of a door magnified 1,000 times. The other pones raised their heads and answered with a variety of blasts and trills. Glurk motioned the others up onto Acretongue's back.
"The mouls will have heard that,"
said Pismire.
"Won't matter," said Glurk. "The pones have decided to go home. The mouls don't interest them any more. They don't like them. I think they think we're interesting."
"Now, listen, Glurk," said Pismire. I'm not saying you're not, quite bright, but I don't think you could have learned a language and all these other things in just a few—"
"Didn't," said Glurk, smirking. "Knew what to expect before I come here."
"How?"
"Tell you later. Be polite, by the way. She said they understand people very well."
"And who's she?"
Pismire demanded.
Tell you soon,
said Glurk. He was enjoying himself in a quiet way. For the whole of his life, Pismire had known more than he did. It was nice, just for once, to be Mr. Answers. At the far end of the cave was a thick bronze door. The first two pones walked straight into it, tearing it off its hinges. Once outside, the herd broke into a trot, with Akatung moving up into the lead. Up on Akatung's back, the four of them were shaken like small peas in a big pot. Pismire saw a pack of mounted mouls galloping after them, spears ready to throw. 3 pones detached themselves from the herd and turned. The mouls suddenly realized they weren't chasing a herd of fleeing animals. Pismire stood up in the saddle.
"They've gone over them," he said.
They hate mouls, said Glurk. They think they're very uninteresting.
Ahead of them was the archway, surrounded by a milling throng of mouls and Vortgorns.
"But all they've got to do is lower that platform and we're done for,"
shouted Pismire.
They won't,
yelled Glurk, and pointed.
He powers the platform.
Beside the gateway, they noticed for the first time a large treadmill. There was a pone in it. A pack of mouls were attacking it with whips and goads, but it stood stolidly, trumpeting. Akatung bellowed back.
They'll rescue it,
said Glurk. Some pones hurled themselves towards the mill, tossing mouls aside like dust. The caged pone shrugged itself free and then leapt through the gateway.
"They must be mad," said
Pismire.
"That platform won't hold them."
We shall see,
said Glurk as they clattered onto it. The other pones piled on behind them. Something went clang above them, and the remains of the treadmill spun until it was nothing but a blur. The chains shrieked over their pulleys. The wall rushed past. Pismire had crouched down in the saddle. They were going to be crushed when they hit the bottom, he knew. Only Glurk saw the pones leaping from the platform one by one. The tiny wings opened. They were too small to carry pones, but they worked. With only Akatung's weight upon it, the platform slowed down and hit the dust with a thud. Akatung lumbered off, while all about them, pones crashed down through the hairs like falling fruit. The others looked up at Glurk's face.
"You knew we wouldn't crash,"
said Pismire accusingly.
Hoped, said Glurk. I wasn't too sure, even after all Kulena said.
"Who's Kulena? Is he the sheep?"
said Pismire. He was badly rattled.
Kulena's hard to describe, said Glurk. I think she's a sort of white.
"A sort of white?"
said Pismire.
You'll have to ask her yourself, said Glurk. We're going to see her now.
No, we're not, said Bane. We must go to Ware. I have to tell them about this.
"They might know already,"
said Pismire glumly.
They don't, said Glurk.
"How do you know?"
We're the only ones who know about the Maul army, said Glurk. We'll have to go to Ware to warn people, but first we got to go back to talk to Kulena.
"Why?"
said Pismire.
To tell her what we've seen, said Glurk,
smiling in a puzzled kind of way. He scratched his head.
So she can remember what we tell her now and tell me 2 days ago when I met her.
Bricando opened his mouth, but Pismire waved him into silence.
"Whites remember the future as well as the past," he said. "But, look, they never tell anyone, Glurk."
This one does, said Glurk. Don't look at me like that. You think I could make this sort of thing up? You'll see where she lives, he continued. I don't think people see it unless she wants them to. She's very strange. There she was, and she told me where you were going and how I could hang on to the bottom of that lifting cart and pinch the armour off a Vortgorn and release the pones and how they could fly. Everything.
"How did she know all this?"
Bricando demanded.
Because we're going to tell her, said Glurk. Don't ask me how it works.
They remember forwards as well as backwards, said Bane.
"But we must get back to the tribe,"
said Pismire.
"And my people," said Bricando. "They need us."
I've been thinking about that, said Glurk. There's 200 Munrungs and 3,000 deaf meanies, and they're all armed and together, and they need us. And Snibril's with them, isn't he?
Said Bricando. Yes, we hope so.
Right then, I think we need them. Anyway, we must see Kulena.
Glurk's right, said Pismire. If she's told him something she remembers from the future and we don't go, then, I don't know, anything could happen. The whole fabric of the carpet could roll up or something.
For the rest of that day, the Pones moved on. On Acatung's back, the four dozed, or looked out silently at the lengthening shadows. And then the Pones stepped through. Hares clustered in closely on the borders of a wide clearing, reflecting the dim glow from the thing in its centre. It was one uncut crystal of sugar, high as the great palace of Geopard, whiter than a bone. In parts it shone like polished varnish, reflecting the faces of the creatures that clustered round it. There were dust rabbits and weft borers of all colours, pigs by the herd, groan pipers, scurrying goats with spiral horns, and creatures even Pismire couldn't recognise. The clearing was filled with the sound of 1,000 tongues licking. Acatung and his herd pounded forward.
It's beautiful,
whispered Bricando at last. They climbed down from the Pone's back and walked gingerly up to the smooth surface. Glurk cracked a piece off with his knife and stood crunching it thoughtfully.
Have a taste,
he said, tossing a piece to Bane. Bane bit it cautiously. Sugar, said Bane. I've only tasted it once before. There was a crystal down near the heartlands.
Like honey, but different,
said Bricando.
How did it get here? Like grit and salt and ash do, from above,
said Pismire.
We don't know any more than that.
Instinctively, they looked up at the spreading hares.
Well, here's our lunch anyway.
Bricando's voice broke the silence.
Take your pick, fried trump or baked groma. Mind you, he added, it hardly seems sporting to kill them while they're not looking.
So put away your knife, said a new voice. Pismire choked on his sugar. A figure stood a little way away. It was tall, with the thin face of a white, and looked ghostly in the light of the crystal. It had a mass of white hair. It was hard to see where the hair ended and the shapeless long robe began, and she was young, but as she moved, sometimes she was old. One of her hands held the collar of a white snarg, which was swishing its tail menacingly.
Said Glurk, this is Kulena.
The white walked past them and patted Acatung's flank. The Pone's long neck turned, and his little eyes looked at Kulena. Then he clumsily lowered himself to his knees and laid his head on the ground. Kulena turned and smiled. The whole clearing seemed to smile with her. The change was sudden and dramatic. So, here you are, she said. And now you must tell me of your adventures. Follow me. There will be food. At the far side of the clearing was Kulena's home, or one of her homes. It was no more than a roof of woven dust on poles. Above it was a large hive of hymetors. Animals cropped and dozed peacefully around Kulena's camp. When Glurk and the others approached, the hymetors hummed furiously and rose from their hive in an angry swarm. The four ducked and tried to protect their faces with their arms, until Kulena whistled once. The creatures swooped harmlessly overhead and returned peacefully to their home in the hares. Glurk caught a glimpse of long, sharp stings.
She sent them back,
whispered Bricando urgently.
She just whistled, and they obeyed her.
They sat down. Pismire shifted uneasily, and Kulena smiled at him. Say what you think, she said. I remember that you did, but you must say it.
Whites mustn't tell people the future, said Pismire. Everyone knows that. They never tell. It's too dangerous for people to know what will happen.
Yes, I know the rules, said the White. They are only rules. I am not, Pismire, quite like other Whites. Have you ever heard the word Thunog? I know you have.
Oh, yes, the Whites who can remember things that... Oh, My word, said Pismire, shocked. I thought that was just a story.
It is just a story, but that doesn't mean it isn't true. The rules don't apply to me. They're only rules. I don't care much for cities, but this crushing and destruction of the carpet, this forging of bronze and trampling of dust... She shook her head. No, this shall not be. You will go to Ware tomorrow, before the mouls leave Geopard. There will be a battle. You must win. I will not tell you how. In the meantime, you may spend this night here.
No, said Bain. I need to know. Why are you helping us? What's different about you?
Kulena put her head on one side. She stood up and walked a little way away from them. Then she turned. Sometimes, very rarely, sometimes a white is born who is different, as different from whites as they are from you. You see, we remember everything.
So do all whites, said Bain.
No, said Kulena. They remember only all those things that happen. We remember things that might happen. For everything that happens, 1,000,000 things don't happen. I live all of them. I remember you winning, and I remember you losing. My brother and sister whites remember the thread of history. But I remember all the threads that never get woven. For me, all possibilities are real.
But why?
Said Bain. Someone must. Otherwise they never could have happened. She stepped into the shadows. Her voice seemed to come from somewhere distant. Nothing has to happen. History isn't something you live. It's something you make. One decision, one person, at the right time. Nothing is too small to make a difference. Anything can be changed. The voice faded. She was gone. Several times that night Bain awoke and thought he heard crashes and cries in the wind, but when he listened hard, they seemed to disappear. Glurk sat up suddenly. It was morning. Bracando was still asleep. The others were talking quietly. One look was enough.
What we dreamt weren't exactly dreams, said Pismire. She lives all her lives at once. We picked up echoes.
I saw Kulena walking through the carpet, began Glurk, and I think I saw Snibril too.
And I saw the hearthlands and the fire in the sky, added Pismire.
Bracando turned over and opened his eyes. He listened to the others for a moment, then nodded.
I was back in the Highgate land. It was a domed cave, and under the dome a throne of bronze with a Vortgorn on it. He had a yellow beard and a crown.
That'd be Stagbat, their king, said Glurk. I heard the Vortgorn guards talking. He looked across at Bain, who had been silent. And what did you dream? He asked.
I dreamt,
Bain began, and then seemed to wake up.
I dreamt of nothing. I slept well.
There was no sign of Kulena. The Pones had stayed.
We'd better go to Ware,
said Bain. I don't think we've got any choice.
We've got lots of choice, said Pismire. It's just that we've got to choose to go to Ware.
Glurk saddled up Acretongue. Interesting times ahead, he said gloomily. Snibril had led the search after the storm. They'd sifted through the rubble of the place. They'd gone down into underlay, roped together, and shouted out the names of those who were lost. They'd found nothing. But, as Pismire would have pointed out, finding nothing was better than finding something. The Munrungs had helped Bracando's people rebuild walls and things, even though the rock itself was now visibly leaning over, and, as someone said, if Fray came again, at least they now knew how to get into underlay.
I'm going to Ware,
Snibril told the tribe that evening. They looked at him in horror.
You can't leave us,
said Dodor Plint, who was the tribe's shoemaker.
You're the leader.
Ware's important, said Snibril. We'd just be simple hunters if it wasn't for the Empire. The Munrungs looked at one another.
We are simple hunters,
said Plint. Yes, but at least we know we are, said Snibble. Anyway, we've got more complicated.
That's true,
said Cruelly Wolf, who was nearly as old as Pismire.
People don't hit one another over the head with clubs as much as they did when I was a boy. There's more arguing.
A Deaf Meanie put up his hand.
That's true, he said. The king always used to throw people off the rock in the old days.
He still does,
said another Deaf Meanie.
Yes, but he doesn't laugh about it so much.
Well, anyway, I'm going south, said Snibble. Perhaps I can find the others.
Yes, but you're our leader,
Plint began again. Then I'm going to lead, snapped Snibble. Who else is coming? Some of the younger Munrungs raised their hands. A Deaf Meanie stood up.
Will there be fighting against impossible odds?
He said. Probably, said Snibble.
Right, count us in.
A lot of Deaf Meanies nodded. Another one said,
And will we get a chance to fight to the death?
You might get a chance to fight to the enemy's death, said Snibble.
Is that as good?
Better.
Right then, we're with you.
In the end, 350 Deaf Meanies and 50 Munrungs volunteered to go. 400, thought Snibble. Who knows how many we're going to face? We must go to where? It's where we all began, in a way. It's where people first realised that there may be a better way of doing things than hitting one another on the head. It was 2 days later. In a grove of red hares, 7 whites were fighting mouls. It was unheard of for whites to be attacked. This moul pack was large, and led by a chieftain more cunning and wily than most. What he wanted was more weapons. Whites looked easy prey. He was beginning to regret this decision. The whites didn't carry weapons, but they did carry tools. And a hammer is a weapon if you hit a head instead of a nail. They were standing around their big varnish boiler and fighting back, hammering back. But they were outnumbered, and they were all going to die. They knew it. There was someone watching who knew it too. Kulena the Thunog watched from deep in the hares. It would be impossible to describe how a Thunog sees things. It would be like trying to explain the stars to a fish. How can it be said that she watched the fight 1,000,000 times, all at the same instant, and every time the whites lost? It's the wrong description, but it will have to do. But among all the outcomes, there was just one, as alone as a pearl on a seashore of black sand, that was different. She turned without moving and concentrated on it. The hares erupted people. The mouls turned to fight, but suddenly they were between 2 enemies. The Deaf Meanies and the Munrungs had found an unbeatable fighting method. The tall Munrungs stood behind the small Deaf Meanies and fought over the top of them. No enemy had much of a chance on 2 levels at once. It was a short fight, and a terribly effective one. After a few minutes, the remaining mouls ran for it. And then it was all over, in this pearl on a seashore time, when someone whose whole life was a choice had been close enough to choose. Athan, the kiln master, leader of this white band, looked up with horror as a white horse trotted through the lines of his rescuers. There was a small figure riding it.
How can this be? We were supposed to die, he said. All of us.
Did you want to? Said Snibble, dismounting.
Want? Want? That doesn't come into it,
said Athan.
You changed things, he said, and now terrible things will happen.
They don't have to, said Snibble calmly. Nothing has to happen. You can let things happen, but that's not the same. We're going to where? Why not come? Athan looked shocked and angry.
Us? Whites? Fighting?
You were fighting just now.
Yes, but we knew we would lose,
said Athan. How about fighting and hoping you'll win? Said Snibble. He turned as a Munrung approached, carrying a white.
Our Jerry Dan is dead, and one of the Deaf Meanie,
said the Munrung.
And one of the whites. But this one's still alive, just.
That is Derna,
said Athan.
My daughter. She should be dead. In a way, she must be dead.
We have some medicines, said Snibble quietly. Or we could bury her now, if that's what you want. He looked expectantly at the kiln master, who had gone white. "No," he said, almost in a whisper. "Good, 'cause we wouldn't have done it anyway."
"But I don't know what will happen next," said the white. "I can't remember."
"You joined us and went to where?" said Snibrill.
"I can't remember what's going to happen."
"You joined us," Snibrill repeated. Relief flooded across Athan's face.
"Did I?"
he said. "Why not?" said Snibrill.
"But this is Thunog thinking," said Athan. "The future can be all different things."
"Pick your own," said Snibrill.
"But destiny—"
"That's something you make up as you go along," said Snibrill. "I've been finding that out." He looked up at a faint sound. For a moment he thought he saw a pale figure in the shadows smiling at him. Then it vanished. 1,000,000 times the whites lost and were killed. But that was somewhere else, in a world that might have been. And now they were alive. And that's known as history, which is only written by the living. They went by narrow tracks that wound in and out of overgrown thickets. At last they reached a Dumai road. All the signs pointed to where. They rode along it a little way. That's when they found the Legion, or what was left of it. Dumai soldiers were sitting or lying amongst the hares by the side of the road. Some of them were asleep, others were wounded. They hardly bothered to look up as Snibrill rode by, but the ones who did caught sight of the deaf meanies and started nudging their colleagues. One or two even reached for their swords. There was muttering from the deaf meanies too. Snibrill turned in his saddle. "Don't make any trouble," he snapped.
"Why not?"
said a sullen, deaf meanie voice.
"They're Dumai."
"You'd prefer them to be mouls, would you?" He walked Roland over to a group of soldiers sitting on a fallen hare. "Where's your leader?" he said. The Dumai looked him up and down. "Haven't got one," he said. "General got killed." There was a pause. "I expect you're wondering who we are," said Snibrill. "Too tired to wonder," said the soldier, leaning back against a hare. "Stand up straight!" For a moment Snibrill wondered who had said that. Then he realized that it had been him. To his amazement, the soldier pulled himself upright. "Now, take me to the highest-ranking officer," said Snibrill. "I mustn't say please," he thought. He's used to orders. That'd be Sergeant Carrius, if he's still alive. Take me to him now!" The soldier snapped back to attention. "Yes, sir, this way," he said. Snibrill was led past groups of sullen soldiers to a heavy-set man who was sitting on the ground. One arm was in a sling, and his face was pale. "Sergeant Carrius, 15th Legion," he said, "or what's left of it. We were called back to Ware urgently from Ultima Maris, but when we were on the road—" "There was a storm," said Snibrill automatically. "And then afterwards you were attacked by mouls mounted on snargs," said Snibrill. "Yeah, time and again. How did you know that?" "I'm good at guessing," said Snibrill. "How many of you are there?" "About 300 able-bodied and a lot of wounded." "I know a safe city where your wounded can be taken. It's only 2 days' easy march if we spare some soldiers to escort them." "There'll be mouls everywhere," said the sergeant. "Not where we've been," said Snibrill quietly. "Not any more. And the rest of us will go with you to where?" The sergeant looked down at the dust, thinking. "Where's this paradise, then?" he said. "Geopard," said Snibrill. At that moment there was a roar from the road. Both of them hurried back to where there was now a huge pushing crowd of Dumai and deaf meanies, with the Munrungs trying to keep them apart. Snibrill pushed his way through and found a deaf meanie and a soldier rolling over and over on the road, punching at one another. Snibrill watched them for a moment and then flung his spear on the ground. "Stop that!" he shouted. "You're soldiers! You're not supposed to fight!" Even the combatants stopped to work that one out.
"He called me dirty,"
said the deaf meanie who had been fighting. "Well, you are," said Snibrill. "So's he. We all are. Now get up." He stopped. All the Dumai were looking past him, to Athan and the whites, and Snibrill heard the whispering start.
They've got whites with them, fighting. They know the future, and they're on his side.
Why should we fight for them if they treat us like that?
said a deaf meanie. Snibrill spun around and picked up the astonished warrior by his collar. You're not fighting for them, you're fighting for yourselves. The deaf meanie was shaken, but not afraid.
We've always fought for ourselves, he said, and we were never counted.
No, but the Empire was all around you, wasn't it, keeping you safe? The Dumai kept the peace over half the carpet, all around you, kept you safe.
They never did.
Think about it. There's Dumai towns all around you. When they defended themselves, they were defending you. They fought for real so that you could fight them for fun. Snibrill was shaking with anger. There was silence. He put the deaf meanie down. I'm going to where? He said. Anyone else wants to come? It's up to them. No one left, except for a small group who were going to accompany the wounded back to Geopard. 2 of the whites went with them. The Dumai felt a lot better with whites around. The rest of them marched on down the road. Snibrill found that he was in command. The Munrungs wanted to follow him. The deaf meanies were beginning to think that anyone who could lose their temper that badly was probably a king. And the Dumai, well, the Dumai soldiers followed Sergeant Carius, and Sergeant Carius was riding alongside Snibrill. Most armies are in fact run by their sergeants. The officers are there just to give things a bit of tone and prevent warfare becoming a mere lower-class brawl. The sergeant half-turned in his saddle and looked back at the deaf meanies. "Nice to have cavalry on our side again," he said, "even if they're still shorter than infantry. I fought against them a couple of times, tough little people. That was under Banius. He respected them. He left them alone. I think he quite liked them." "Banius," said Snibrill cautiously. "Yes, whatever happened to him?"
"You know him?"
"I've heard of him," said Snibrill carefully.
"He killed someone. An assassin. Someone was trying to kill the young emperor during his coronation, hiding behind a pillar with a bow. Banius spotted him and threw his sword at him. Got him just in time. Killed him grit dead. Arrow missed Targon by inches. Funny thing is, Banius hated Targon. He was always in trouble. He said emperors shouldn't be hereditary, but elected, just like they used to be. A stickler for honesty was the general, but after that he had to be banished, of course."
"Why, of course?" said Snibrill.
"No one is allowed to draw a sword within 50 paces of the emperor," said the sergeant.
"But he saved his life."
"Yeah, but you've got to have rules. Otherwise, where would we be?" said Sergeant Carius. "But afterwards the emperor had the law changed, and they sent someone after the general."
"Did he ever find him?"
"I think so. He was sent back tied to his horse with an apple in his mouth. I think the general was a bit upset. We could do with him now, and that's a fact," finished the sergeant.
A scattering of campfires speckled the darkness. It was the second night of the journey of all 4 races. Snibrill and the sergeant had made sure that there was at least one Munrung at each campfire as referees. "What's the plan?" asked Snibrill.
"Plan?" said Carius. "I don't know. I'll just fight. All I know is what the messenger said. All the legions are going back to where?"
"All 15?" said Snibrill. He rubbed his head. It was feeling sort of squashed. The sergeant looked surprised.
15? We haven't got 15. Oh, yes, we're called the 15th, but a lot got disbanded."
"So, how many are there?" said Snibrill.
3.
3 legions? How many people is that?"
"About 3,000 men."
"But that's not enough to—" Snibrill stopped and then raised his hand slowly to his head. "Tell everyone to lie down," he muttered. "Put out their fires and lie down."
"Why?"
said the sergeant. "And they must be ready to fight," said Snibrill. His head felt as though someone was treading on it. He could hardly think. Carius was looking at him as if he was ill. "Please, can't explain. Do it now!" Carius ran off. He could hear him shouting orders to the corporals. The deaf meanies and Munrungs didn't need telling twice. A moment later, Fray struck. It was away to the south, not far. The hare bowed and then whipped furiously as a wind blew clouds of dust through the carpet. And then there was the thump. Carius crawled around and then, still not standing up, shuffled over to Snibril. "You felt it coming," he said, "even before the animals." "The mouls can too," said Snibril, "and they're better at it than me. They can sense when it's going to happen, and then they attack afterwards when everyone's shaken." He and Carius looked around at the hares. "To arms, everyone!" the sergeant yelled. A deaf meanie raised his hand.
"What does that mean?" he said. "We've all got 2 arms."
"Means you've got to fight."
"Oh, right."
It was only seconds later that the mouls attacked, but seconds were enough. 100 of them galloped into what should have been a camp of bewildered, wounded, and unprepared victims. They found instead bewildered, wounded, and extremely well-prepared, and moreover enraged fighters. They were surprised, but their surprise didn't last long. It was, very accurately, the surprise of their life. The moul attack changed things. Deft meanies and Dumai had always fought, but never on the same side. The little army swung down the road to Ware, singing. "Have you noticed the whites ran away in the night?" said the sergeant. "Not run away," said Snibril. "I don't think they've run away. That doesn't sound like them. I think they've decided to do something else." He stopped. They had been passing through the area that had been right under Fray. Hares were bent and twisted, and over the road was an arch. Had been an arch. There were some dead soldiers nearby, and one dead moul. "What is this place?" said Snibril. "One of the gates to the Werelands. The city's further on." "I've always wondered what it looked like," said Snibril. "Me too," said the sergeant. "We should be there in a few hours." "Where?" said Snibril. Ware had been built between and round 5 giant hares. There were really 3 cities, ringed one inside the other. Inside the thick outer walls was Imperial Ware, a city of wide avenues paved with wood and salt. Few people actually lived in Imperial Ware. It was a city for looking at, not living in. Outside it, separated by a wall of sharpened hare stakes, was Merchants' Ware, the city most people thought of as the real city. Ware was where people came to trade. And then, off to one side of the bustling city, was a tiny walled enclosure about the size of a village. This was Ware, the first Ware, the little village where the Dumai had begun. Snibril didn't see Old Ware until much later. He saw the walls of the city stretching away on either side. Everything looked peaceful. "There could be trouble if we try to take the deaf meanies in," Carius whispered to Snibril. "Not could," Snibril agreed. "Would. So we'll camp outside for now." "Something's not right," Carius said. "You know how you can sense when there's going to be an attack by Fray?" "Yeah?" "I'm the same about trouble. I can feel it. Come on." Snibril rode after the sergeant through the streets. It was like Tregon Maris, only bigger, much bigger. Carius led him to a barracks just outside the imperial city, and eventually they reached a table out in the open air, at which a skinny little Dumai was sitting behind a pile of papers. He looked harassed.
"Yes?"
he demanded. "I am—" the sergeant began.
"I don't know. People barge in here. I expect you haven't even got any papers, have you?" "No, of course you haven't." "Well, come on, name and rank, name and rank."
"Sergeant Carius, 15th Legion," said Carius.
15th Legion, 15th Legion, said the skinny man, shuffling through the papers.
"We were summoned back," said Carius. "There was a messenger. Return at once to Ware. We had to fight most of—"
"There have been a lot of changes," said the paper shuffler.
"What sort of changes?" Snibril said quickly. The man looked at him.
"Who's this?"
he said suspiciously. "Look," said Carius patiently, "we've come all the way back because—"
"Oh, this Fray business," said the skinny man. "All sorted out. There's been a treaty."
"A treaty? With Fray? Said Snibbrill.
A peace treaty with the mouls, of course. Don't you know anything?
Snibbrill opened his mouth. Carrius gripped his arm. "Oh," he said loudly and distinctly. "Well, isn't that nice? We won't disturb you further. Come, Snibbrill." "Why did you do that?" said Snibbrill as the sergeant hurried him out. "Because if we want to find out things, we won't find 'em out by making that clerk eat all his little bits of paper," said Carrius. The army camped out among the hares. It was while groups of them picked up firewood among the hares that they found the pones. There were a dozen of them. Pones could hide quite easily in the carpet, they were so big. People think that it's easiest to hide things that are small, but it's almost as easy to hide things that are too big to see. They all turned their heads to look at their discoverers, burped, and then looked away. They looked as if they'd been told to wait for someone. The sign outside the shop said apothecary, which meant that the shop was owned by a sort of early chemist. The apothecary's name was Owlglass. He hummed to himself as he worked in his back room. He'd found a new type of blue fluff, which he was grinding down. It was probably good for curing something. He'd have to try it out on people until he found out what. A hand touched him on the shoulder. He said. He turned around. He peered over the top of his spectacles.
"Pismire,"
he said.
"Keep your voice down. We came in the back way,"
said Pismire.
"My word, I expect you did,"
said Owlglass.
"Don't worry, there's no one in the shop."
He looked past the old man to Glurk and Bane and Bracando.
"My word,"
he said again.
"After all this time, eh? Well, welcome. My house is your house."
His brow suddenly furrowed, and he looked worried.
"Although only in a metaphorical sense, you understand, because I would not, much as I always admired your straightforward approach, actually give you my house, it being the only house I have, and therefore the term is being extended in an, as it were, gratuitous fashion."
Owlglass was clearly having some trouble getting to the end of the sentence. Glurk tapped Pismire on the shoulder. "He's a philosopher too, is he?" said.
"You can tell, can't you?"
said Pismire.
Owlglass, thanks very much. We need some food," he went on, "and most of all,
we want information," said Bane. "What's happening here?"
"Which would you like first?"
said Owlglass. "Food," said Glurk. The others glared at him.
"Make yourself at home," said Owlglass, "although, of course, when I say home, I don't precisely mean—" "Yes, thank you very much," said Pismire.
Owlglass bustled over to a cupboard. Glurk stared at the jars and pots that littered the back room. In some of the jars, things stared back.
"Owlglass and I went to school together," said Pismire. "And then Owlglass decided he was going to study the carpet, the properties of different kinds of hair, rare and strange animals, that sort of thing." "And Pismire decided he was going to study people," said Owlglass, producing a loaf and some butter. "And got sentenced to death for calling the last emperor what was it now?" "Well, he deserved it," said Pismire. "He wouldn't give me any money to preserve the library. He said we didn't need a lot of old books. We knew all we needed to know." "I was trying to remember what you called him." "An ignorant sybarite who didn't have the sense of a meat pie," said Pismire.
"Sounds pretty nasty, sentencing someone to death just for that,"
said Glurk, putting the loaf on his plate. He kept turning around to look at the jar behind him. It had something hairy in it.
"Actually, he got sentenced to death for apologizing," said Owlglass.
"How can you be sentenced to death for apologizing?"
"He said he was sorry, but on reflection he realized that the emperor had got the sense of a meat pie," said Owlglass. "You insulted the emperor?" said Bracando. "I didn't know you were famous."
"And accurate," said Bane. "Targon's father was a disgrace to the Empire. So what's happening in where?" he continued shortly. "There's hardly a guard on the gates. This is disgusting. Don't people know what's happening? The Empire's being attacked. My Empire."
If no one wants that piece of cheese, pass it along, said Glurk.
The Emperor says that ware is perfectly safe, said Owlglass. These new advisers say so, apparently.
Advisers? Said Pismire.
There aren't any pickles around, are there? said Glurk.
Advisers, said Bane. And has anyone seen these advisers?
Don't think so,
said Owlglass.
Is there any more of this cucumber?
It's how they work, said Bane. From inside, like Geopard and the High Gateland.
Yes, but not where,
said Pismire.
Hardly anyone is allowed in the palace these days,
said Owlglass.
What can we do?
said Pismire.
Slice 'em,
said Glurk, waving a cucumber. Bane put his hand on his sword. Yes, he said. I knew this would happen. Where was a great city once. We fought for things, and when we got them, we just sat back. No more effort, no more pride, just fat young emperors and stupid courtiers. Well, I'm not having that. Let's go. He stood up. Oh, no, said Pismire. What are you going to do? Barge into the palace waving your sword and kill any mouls you see? Bracando stood up too.
Good thinking,
he said. That's ridiculous. Tell them, Glurk.
Yes, it is ridiculous, said Glurk.
Right, said Pismire.
We finish our tea, said Glurk, and then attack the palace.
Mad, said Pismire. Listen, said Bane, standing up. You know what she said. Nothing is too small to make a difference. One person at the right time.
There's 3 of us,
said Bracando. Even better. Oh, blast, I suppose I'd better come, sighed Pismire, if only to see you don't do anything too stupid.
Can I come too?
said Owlglass. See, said Bane. Imagine what a difference 5 can make. After a while, Glurk said,
Anyone any idea about how we get in?
Snibril was learning something. He was learning about the power of sergeants. Carrius had found the palace kitchens, because sergeants always know how to find a kitchen, and then he'd found the head cook, who was an old friend.
This is Mealy,
he said, introducing Snibril to a huge red-faced man with a scar across his nose, a patch over one eye, and only one arm.
He used to be in the army like me.
Was he a sergeant too? said Snibril.
That's right,
said Mealy, grinning. The scar seemed to grin too. When he stepped around the table, Snibril saw that he had a wooden leg. Strange stuff happening, Mealy, said the sergeant.
No error, said Mealy. Top brass have been sacked all over the place. No one's seen the Emperor for a fortnight. Spends all his time in his rooms. Has all his meals sent in.
And these advisers, said Snibril. What about them?
No one's seen 'em,
said Mealy, scratching his back with a ladle. Moulish, said Snibril. Several other cooks had wandered up and were listening with interest. They all looked very similar to Mealy. There were 6 of them, but only enough arms and legs for about 4 people.
Right, said Mealy. We don't like it, but there's only a handful of us. If we had some lads with us...
Carrius and Snibril looked at one another. They're right here, in the palace, said Snibril. He looked around at the cooks. They were all very big men. You were all sergeants, weren't you? He said. I can tell. Let's go and... He stared into the darkness at the end of the sooty kitchen. Who's she? He said.
Who?
The sergeant turned. Snibril hesitated. There was someone there, he mumbled. In white. He stopped.
No women in the kitchens, said Mealy.
Snibril shook himself. Must have imagined it, he told himself. Sergeant Carrius, can you get back and bring the army? He said. To attack where? Said Carrius. To defend it, said Snibril. Who will we be fighting? By the time we get back, I hope we'll have an enemy, said Snibril. Have you cooks got any weapons? Mealy grinned. He picked up a long meat cleaver and brought it down on a chopping block. The chopping block split. Oh, us? He said. The guards on the palace gate were nervous anyway. They didn't like their job, but orders are orders, even if you're not sure where they came from. And they were even more nervous when 4 heavily cloaked whites turned up at the gate pushing a cart. One of the guards stepped forward. "Halt!" he said. His companion nudged him. "They're whites," he said.
"That's right,"
said one of the whites. The first guard said doubtfully, "But one of them's eating a cucumber." "I expect whites have to eat." "I don't think you're whites at all," said the first guard. The white who was eating cucumber turned its head towards him.
"Can prove it,"
it said.
"Can tell you the future."
"Oh, yes." The white took a club off the cart.
"Going to get hit,"
said Glurk. "Not too hard," said Bain, pushing his hood back. "He's not an enemy." Glurk hit the guard in as friendly a way as possible. The second guard started to draw his sword, but felt something pointed touch his back.
"Drop the sword,"
said Pismire.
"And when we say drop, we mean let go in a downward direction," said Owlglass, hopping up and down. "Isn't this exciting?"
Mealy knocked on a large ornate door. Two cooks behind him were pushing a trolley. A white tablecloth hung down on all sides. After a while, a courtier opened the door.
"Dinner,"
said Mealy.
"bring it in."
"Oh, the cook." "Very well," said the courtier. The trolley was wheeled through. There was another room beyond. It was empty. There was a closed door in the opposite wall.
"Leave it in there,"
said the courtier.
"then be off." "Right, right,"
said Mealy. The cooks pushed the trolley into the next room. Then they filed out obediently.
"Don't you ever wonder what happens next?"
said Mealy. "It's not my job to wonder about the Emperor's business," sniffed the courtier, "and certainly not with a cook."
"In fact,"
said Mealy, taking off his tall cook's hat,
"I'm the sergeant. You lads there, attention!"
Two guards stood to attention. Several more cooks filed into the room. Each of them was carrying something sharp. "This is—" the courtier began, and then realized that he was in a room with half a dozen large armed men. "Against orders," he said. Mealy limped over to the door and put his one ear to it.
"Just waiting to see what happens next."
The long cloth made a sort of mobile tent. Snibrill heard the door shut behind him. After a minute or two, another door opened. He smelled moul. The trolley moved. The door shut, and this time it shut behind him, in a very final kind of way. Only now did he hear voices.
"Your dinner, sire."
A moul voice.
"I'm not hungry."
It was a human voice, but with a sulky whine in it.
"Sire must eat."
Moul voice.
"Otherwise there will be nothing left of sire."
"What's happening outside? Why won't you tell me what's happening outside?"
"The civil war rages on."
Another moul voice.
"You have enemies on all sides. Only we can protect you."
"I'll call Fray down on them."
The Emperor, thought Snibrill, horrified. Only well-bred people can be as rude as that.
"Soon, soon, just as we did in Geopard."
A third moul voice.
"I'm hungry now. Have you finished tasting my food?"
"Not quite, sire."
"But it's nearly all gone."
"Poison could be even in the last bite,"
said a moul voice, and it occurred to Snibrill it was speaking with its mouth full.
Yes, of course you're right,"
said the Emperor uncertainly.
"I've never trusted those cooks. They've got far too many bits missing. Even so, perhaps a crust."
"Why, certainly, sire. I think we can trust a little of this gravy."
"We've come all this way to defend this," thought Snibrill. And then he thought, what would Bain say about this? He'd say, he's the Emperor, whatever else he might be. You've got to do something. Oh, well, I just hope Mealy is still outside.
"I thought those guards took it very well, considering,"
said Pismire.
"Considering what?"
said Glurk.
"Considering we've just hit them. They positively wanted to be tied up, I thought. They didn't like what they had to do." "I still did it, though,"
said Bricando.
"Stupid."
They reached another archway. There were two more guards there. Bain stepped forward.
"You, men,
Eyes face. Present. Arms. Very good. Come on, people. One of the soldiers looked doubtful.
Got orders to let no one through,
he managed. We're not anyone, said Bain, and that's an order. The guard stood to attention.
Yes, sir. Very good, sir, he said.
Don't talk to me. I'm not here, said Bain. The guard started to speak, and then nodded instead. Good man. Come on. Owlglass tapped the guard on the shoulder as he passed through.
Of course, when we say we're not here, we mean only in a figurative or...
Pismire grabbed him by his collar.
Come on!
There were 4 mouls in the room, staring at Snibril in astonishment. There was also a young man of about his age, who oddly enough was reacting faster than the mouls. The Emperor raised a pudgy hand covered in rings.
"He's not a cook," he wailed. "He's all there, so why's he here?"
Snibril dropped his spear and grabbed the arm. "You come with me," he said, and added, "Sire." He waved his sword at the mouls. "It's 1 against 4, he said. "That means I'm 4 times more likely to hit one of you." The Emperor struggled in Snibril's grip. "I'm here to rescue you," said Snibril. "These are mouls. They're destroying the Empire."
"The Empire is safe and well,"
said the Emperor smugly. Snibril was astonished. "What about Fray?" he said.
"Jonrelish and his people can control Fray," said the Emperor. "Fray only strikes my enemies, isn't that so?"
"Yes, sir,"
said the one called Jonrelish. He was a tall moul. This one's not like Gormalish, Snibril thought. This one looks clever.
"Drop the sword and let go of him," said Jonrelish. "If you don't, we will call down Fray."
"Right now?" said Snibril.
"Yes."
"Do it then."
"No!"
wailed the Emperor. Snibril's head felt quite clear. "You can't," he said. "They can't, sire. It's just a threat. They can't do it." Now he had time to look around. He could see in one corner of the big room a hole. "You came up from Underlay," he said. "That was clever." The mouls drew their swords and dashed towards him. Snibril backed towards the door, fending off blows as best he could. He kicked the door. "Mealy, open up!" The door swung open. The room beyond was empty. Snibril dragged the Emperor into it. The cooks had been standing behind the doors. They stepped, or at least hopped, out. Mealy hit a moul over the head with a ladle. "There's more coming out of a hole in the floor," said Snibril. "Good!"
"What's happening? Why's all this happening?"
said the Emperor. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked frightened and a lot younger. Most of the mouls dived back into the hole, colliding with one another in their desperation to escape. Mealy's kitchen army dragged a heavy table across the room and upended it over the hole. Mealy wiped his hand on his apron. "Ah," he said. "All done." "I'm afraid we're only just beginning," said Snibril. "There could be thousands of them underneath us right now."
"Everyone must do what I say," screamed the Emperor. "I am in charge."
The sergeants turned to look at him. The Emperor's little piggy eyes glanced from Mealy to the table to Snibril and back again. Then he shouted,
"Guards!"
A couple of armed men stepped into the room.
"I want these men locked up,"
shouted the Emperor. "Really?" said Bain. "What for?" They brought the army in. In order to save a lot of explaining, they did it by getting a signed order from the Emperor. It was signed of his own free will, after Glurk explained patiently that if it wasn't signed of his own free will, there would be trouble. Then there was a council of war. "I always knew this would happen," said Bain. "Once upon a time the Emperor was elected. Then Targon made it hereditary, so that stupid brat of his could take over. Hardly anyone objected. It's as bad as having kings."
"That's going too far,"
said Bricando. "Don't start arguing," said Snibril. "We ought to be wondering what the mouls are doing." "They're doing what they always do," said Bain. "They're waiting for Fray, so they can attack when everyone's disorganized."
"It'll happen,"
said Pismire despondently.
"Where's the Emperor?"
"Glurk and the cooks have got him locked up in the kitchens," said Bain. He looked down at a scrap of paper in front of him. "With every fighting man we've got, we're still less than 1,500 people," he said.
"Less than that, in fact,"
said Pismire.
You can't leave women and children and old people in the city. We'll have to get them to safety and guard them. No, arm the women, said Bricando.
Don't be stupid, said Vane. Women don't know how to fight.
Deaf-meany women do,
said Bricando. Oh, yes? Who with?
Deaf-meany men,
said Bricando.
He's got a point,
said Pismire.
My granny had a wallop like a wrestler.
I absolutely forbid it, said Vane. Women fighting, that's not warfare, that's just a vulgar mess.
Fine,
said Bricando.
All right. No fighting women.
Snibbrill noticed that he was grinning in a funny way. Besides, said Vane, there's not enough weapons to go round as it is.
There's a whole armoury in the palace,
said Owlglass. When we unlocked it, there was nothing in there but a hole in the floor, said Vane. The mouls have got them. He slapped his hand on the table.
They're out there, he said, and down there. I know it, just waiting. After Fray strikes, they'll attack. That's how it'll happen.
Snibbrill had been listening to this. I can help, he said. They all looked at him. I can sense when Fray's coming, he said.
It's true, said Sergeant Carrius. I've seen him do it.
Well, that'll be a help, said Vane. No, you don't understand, said Snibbrill. What do the mouls do before Fray strikes?
How should I know, said Vane. Lie down and put their hands over their eyes if they're sensible, and then attack immediately.
He seemed to think about this. When they expect to find a crushed enemy, he finished. Snibbrill nodded. Pismire said,
It might work, you know. Forewarned is forearmed.
There was silence, and then Bricando said,
Forearmed? Does that mean we can hold twice as many swords?
They won. And that was more or less all the history books said later, after New Ware was built out of the rubble of the city. They were more concerned with the election of Bane as president, since he was considered to be honest and brave and without any imagination. The people who wrote the history books weren't there. They didn't know how it happened, and all the other ways it could have gone. First, there was the question of weapons. Mealy took charge of that. Spears, for example. You tied a kitchen knife on the end of a stick, and you couldn't tell the difference, especially if it got stuck in you. Glurk spent a lot of time helping the sergeants. Bricando was put in charge of guarding the women and children. Snibbrill thought he grinned too much when he agreed to this, and Bane was everywhere, giving orders, making plans. Snibbrill felt at a loose end. Eventually he found Bane, who was leaning on the battlements over one of the main gates looking out at the hares. There were always guards here with a bugle to warn the city in case of attack.
Can't see anything, said Snibbrill. We've sent patrols out.
I wasn't looking for mouls, said Bane.
What were you looking for, then?
No one, said Bane.
A figure in white,
said Snibbrill.
I've seen her, too.
She has to watch, to make things happen.
Bane seemed to pull himself together.
I don't like this, he said briskly. It's too quiet.
Better than too noisy,
said Snibbrill.
How's your head?
Can't feel anything, said Snibbrill.
Sure? Feels fine.
Look, said Snibbrill, everyone's ready. What's going to happen next? You've got the Emperor in prison. What's going to happen afterwards?
Do you think there's going to be an afterwards?
Said Bane gloomily. There's always an afterwards, said Snibbrill. He scratched his head. There was an itch behind his ear. Bane, I thought from what you said that the whites might help, but they just ran off.
Bane
turned. You all right? Snibbrill felt that his ears were being pressed into the middle of his head.
Fray?
Said Bane. Snibbrill nodded, and even that hurt. Bane strode along the top of the wall to the nearest guard and picked up the bugle. It's a funny thing. When there's a warning signal, when people have known forever that there's a warning signal, and that warning signal is sounded for the very first time, people don't react properly. They wander out blearily, saying things like, someone's mucking about with the warning signal, aren't they? And who's blowing the warning signal? That's for warnings, that is. Which is what happened now. Bane looked down at the streets filled with bewildered people and groaned. "It's starting!" he shouted.
Now!
Oh, right.
A moment later the air was filled with shouted orders. Snibrill sank to his knees as Ware emptied itself around him.
Squad 3, main square, keep away from buildings.
Remember, they can come up from underneath.
Okay, line up the pones.
Snibrill groped his way towards the rail where he had tethered Roland. He pulled himself onto the horse's back and joined the flow of people leaving Ware. Then the animals started to feel the effects of Fray. The pones, which were already outside the gate, started to trumpet. Horses neighed and several bolted. The houses began to tremble very gently. Then came the creaking, long and drawn out, as thousands of hairs were forced downwards by the tremendous weight. "It's right overhead," Snibrill thought. Roland cantered through the arch of the gateway. The walls collapsed. The ground moved like the skin of an animal smashing the houses. Snibrill's ears popped. The relief almost made him want to cry. He looked back at the city. Walls were still toppling as the carpet itself bent under Fray, but nearly everyone had got out. Right over us, Snibrill thought, as if something wants to kill us. But Pismire thinks Fray's just some kind of natural force we can't understand. Snibrill looked at the hairs around Ware, which erupted mouls. He had time to turn Roland around and race back towards the city. Bain's head poked up as Roland leapt over the ditch in the dust.
"There's thousands of them."
"Wait until they get closer," said Bain. Snibrill looked along the ditch. At this point, most of the defenders were Dumai bowmen, lying down calmly and watching the black wall moving towards them. "Aren't they close enough yet?" "Not yet," said Bain. "Sergeant Carius, give the signal to be ready."
"Yes, sir."
There was a flicker on the mound of dust behind them. Snibrill and Bain turned to see a white figure staring intently at the onrushing horde. Then it vanished. "Sergeant Carius," said Bain quietly.
"Sir."
"The moment is
now."
"Yes, sir. Squad 1, wait for it, wait for it. Squad 1, fire! Squad 1 back, Squad 2 forward. Squad 2, fire!"
Not many people had ever seen Dumai archers in action, or rather they had, but since arrows had been heading towards them, they'd never had much of a chance to make detailed notes. There was a howl from the attackers. That was another Dumai lesson. Hit the front line of a rushing attack, and the enemy had to spend too much time trying to avoid tripping over itself. Defmenes had a technique for fighting enemies 3 times as high as they were. They'd run up them until they got to shoulder height and hang on with one hand and fight with the other. It meant that half the mouls were stabbing at their own heads. There were 2 more charges before it dawned on the mouls that things had gone wrong. They grouped around the hares, and there were still too many of them.
"We could keep this up all day," said
Bricando. "No, we can't," said Bain. "We've got enough for 1 more charge, and that's it. And if it comes to hand fighting, they've got more hands than we have."
"I thought we were forearmed,"
said Bricando. "Figure of speech. We're outnumbered and outweaponed." "Here they come again," said Snibrill. "Hang on. Just a few of them. Look." 6 snargs were trotting out of the line. "They want to talk," said Bain.
"Can we trust 'em?"
said Clerk. "No."
"Good. I'd hate to trust something like them."
"But you should talk," said Pismire. In the end, they rode out to the mouls. Snibrill recognized the leader, who now had a crown of salt crystals, and watched them imperiously. But Bain was more interested in Gormalish, who was among the party. "Well," said Bain, "what do you have to say?"
"My name is Jornaralish," said the moul with the crown. "I offer you peace. You cannot win. Throw away your weapons, then we will talk further."
"Throw away my sword first?" said Bain, as if he was considering the question.
"Yes, you have no choice."
Jornaralish's gaze swept from face to face. "Throw away my sword," Bain said slowly. "It's an attractive idea." He drew the sword and held it up. "Gormalish," he said. Bain's arm moved in the blur of speed. The sword slid through the air like a knife, hitting the moul in the throat. Gormalish dropped silently, staring in horror. "There," said Bain. "That's how we throw our swords away in war." He turned his horse and galloped back to the city, with the others trying to keep up. John Relish hadn't moved a muscle.
"That was very my eye of you,"
said Pismire.
"I'm surprised."
"He was drawing his sword," said Bain. "Didn't you see?"
"They're getting ready for another charge,"
said Glurk. Bain looked back at the worried faces of the defenders. "Get the pones ready. We'll use everything we've got."
"Everything?"
said Bracando.
"Right."
He trotted his pony back along the ditch. They waited.
"Here they come,"
said Glurk, picking up his spear. "Right," said Bain. "Oh, has anyone got a spare sword?" In the end, it's people fighting. Arrows and spears everywhere, swords cutting bits off people. The maps can't show the fear and the noise and the excitement. Afterwards it's better, because if there's an afterwards, it's because you're still alive. Snibril ducked and stabbed his way through the melee. There seemed to be mouls everywhere. The defenders were losing. You could feel it in the air. For every moul that was beaten, there were 2 more to take their place. He rolled down a slope and found Bain there, holding off a couple of the enemy. As Snibril landed, one of the mouls sunk to the ground. A backhand swipe took care of the other. "We're losing," said Snibril. "We need a miracle." There was a bugle call behind them. The mouls turned. There was another army advancing. Bracando was in the lead. They could hear his shout over the noise.
"Madam, hold it by the other end. Now, ladies, don't all push. Careful of that spear. You could do someone a mischief." "Isn't that the point, young man?"
said an old lady who shouldn't have been anywhere near a battlefield.
"No, madam, that is the butt. The point is the sharp bit at the other end. Then out of the way, young man, so as I can use it."
The women weren't the most efficient fighters Bain had ever seen, but Bracando had spent a couple of days giving them some secret training. Besides, not having been trained as proper soldiers was even a help. Do-my-eye soldiers weren't up to novel ways invented as you went along, like hitting an enemy across the back of the knees with the end of a spear and stabbing him as he fell over. The women fought nastier. And it still wasn't enough. Deep in the hares, Culaina the Thunog moved without walking. She passed through future after future, and there they were, nearly all alike. Defeat, the end of the empire, the end of the unimaginative men who thought there was a better way of doing things than fighting, the death of Bain, the death of Snibril, everyone dead, for nothing. Now she moved without running, faster and faster through all the future of maybe. They streamed past her. These were all the futures that never got written down. All of them had to happen somewhere. "But not here," she said. And then there was one, and only one. She was amazed. It was the 1,000,000-to-1 chance that the defenders would win. She was fascinated. They were strange people, the Do-my-eye. They thought they were as level-headed as a table, and yet in a great big world full of chaos and darkness, they acted as though they really believed in their little inventions like law and justice. Amazing that they should have even one chance of a future. Culaina smiled and went to see what it was. What you look at, you change. The mouls pulled back again, but only to regroup. All around the ruins of Ware, people were sitting in small groups or tending the wounded. Snibril hadn't seen Bracando or Pismire for a long time. There was movement among the enemy. Snibril sighed. "Here they come again," he said, standing up.
"History, eh?"
said Glurk, picking up his spear.
"One final glorious stand."
The mouls began to charge, but it seemed half-hearted. The ones in the front kept on coming, but gradually the ones behind slowed down. Within a few seconds they were milling around in bewilderment. The defenders stared.
"Why are they stopping?"
said Glurk. Snibril squinted at the shadows between the hares. "There's something else there," he said.
"More mouls?"
He blinked. "It's whites. Thousands and thousands of whites. They're attacking the mouls." Bain looked around at the defenders. "Then we've got one choice," he said. "Charge!" Caught between two armies, the mouls didn't even have 1,000,000 to 1 chance. And the whites fought like mad things. Worse, they fought like sane things, with the very best weapons they'd been able to make, cutting and cutting. Like surgeons, Pismire said later, or people who had found out that the best kind of future is one you make yourself. Afterwards, they found that Athan the White had died in the fighting. But at least he hadn't known he was going to. Athan's new ideas had flashed like fire from white to white. You don't have to accept it. You can change what's going to happen. It was an idea that had never occurred to them before. And then it was over. No one could find the Emperor. No one looked very hard. No one said anything, but somehow everyone assumed that Bane was in charge now. The question of food was easily settled. There were dead snargs everywhere. As Glurk said, there was no sense in letting them go to waste. And then they brought in Jorna-Elish. He'd been badly injured by a spear, but Glurk's snark-gathering party had found him alive. Despite his wounds, the moul raised his head proudly.
"I will show you how a moul can die," he said.
"We know that already," said Bane matter-of-factly. "What I want to know is, why? Why attack us?"
"We serve Fray. Fray hates life in the carpet." "Merely a natural phenomenon," murmured Pismire, "bound to yield to scientific observation and deduction."
Jorna-Elish growled at him. "Throw him in a cell somewhere," said Bane.
"But we should kill him,"
said Glurk. "No, you've been listening to Bracando too often," said Bane. Bracando bristled.
"You know what he is. Why not kill—"
he began, but he was interrupted. "Because it doesn't matter what he is. It matters what we are." They all looked around, even Jorna-Elish. "It was me," thought Snibril. "I didn't realise I said it aloud. Oh well, that's what matters," said Snibril. "That's why Ware was built, because people wanted to find better ways than fighting, and stop being afraid of the future."
"We never joined the Empire,"
said Bracando. "When it was time to choose, whose side were you on?" said Snibril. "Anyway, you were part of the Empire. You just didn't know it. What would you do if the Empire didn't exist? Go back to throwing people off rocks?"
"I don't throw people off rocks."
Jorna-Elish's head turned from one to the other in fascination.
"These,"
said Jorna-Elish in astonishment,
"these beat me. Weak, stupid people arguing all the time."
"Amazing, isn't it?" said Bane. "Take him away and lock him up."
"I demand an honourable death."
"Listen to me," said Bane, and now the tone of his voice was like bronze. "I killed Gormalish, because people like that shouldn't be allowed to exist. You, I'm not sure about. But if you annoy me one more time, I'll kill you where you stand. Now, take him away." Snibril stared. He'd do it, he thought, here and now. It dawned on him that he'd much rather face a fighting mad Bracando or Jorna-Elish in a fury than Bane.
"Snibril's right, though,"
said Pismire, as the silent moul was hurried off.
"Everyone's done things the old way. Now we'll have to find a new way. The Empire—"
"I'm not sure there's going to be an Empire again," said Bane.
"What? But there's got to be an Empire,"
said Pismire. "There might be something better," said Bane. "I'm thinking about it. Lots of small countries and cities joined together could be better than one big empire. I don't know." He looked up. At the back of the group were some of the whites. They hadn't said anything. A white stepped forward and pulled back his hood, revealing that he was, in fact, a her.
"I have to speak to you,"
she said.
"My name is Tarion the Mine Master. We are leaving now. We think we can feel a future now. We are are remembering once more.
I'm sorry, said Bain.
We have chosen a new thread.
I don't understand you.
We are whites again, proper whites. We think we are beginning to remember a new history. So now, if you please, we will go back to our lives.
She smiled.
I remember I said this.
Oh, said Bain. He looked embarrassed, a practical man faced with something he was too busy to understand. Well, good. I'm glad for you.
We will meet again. We are sure.
Well, thank you again. The whites were already filing out. Snibrill slipped away after them. "Tarry on," he called. She turned.
Yes?
Why go away? What did you mean? She frowned.
We tried this deciding. We listened to Athan. He told us about the way of making choices. We have tried it. It is terrible. How can you do it, living and not knowing what will happen?
We think it's normal, said Snibrill.
How strange. Strange, such courage. Well, goodbye. You have made up your mind to leave where?
Yes, How did you know that? She looked joyful.
I said we can remember things again.
He found Roland where he'd tethered him. Pismire spoke from right behind him, just as he was adjusting the saddle. "Leaving?" Snibrill turned. "I just want to find out about the carpet," he said. "What Fray is. What's at the end of it all? You said we should always ask questions." "Right. Very important questions. Do you think Bain's idea will work? Who knows? It's the time to try new things." "Yes." Snibrill climbed into the saddle. "Now I want to see all the things you told me about," he said. "The chair leg, the hearth, the edge." "Let me know what they're like, then," said Pismire. "I only read about them." "Right." "Yes, I will, if I find time. Well then, goodbye?" "Goodbye. Come back and tell us about it sometime." This last word was a shout, for Snibrill had urged Roland forward. Pismire walked slowly back. Snibrill stopped again a little way from Ware and breathed deeply of the carpet air. He felt a little sad. But there would always be somewhere to return to, somewhere. He smiled and patted Roland's neck. Then, with rising hope and streaming hair, he urged the white horse into a gallop, and they disappeared among the crowding hares.